Venice, Queen of the Sea by Tintoret, central compartment of the ceiling in the Sala dei Pregadi, notable for the sweep of its vast green surges, and for the daring character of its entire conception, though it is wild and careless, and in many respects unworthy of the master. Note the way in which he has used the fantastic forms of the seaweeds, with respect to what was above stated 3, as to his love of the grotesque. The Doge Loredano in Prayer to the Virgin by Tintoret, in the same room, sickly and pale in colour, yet a grand work, to be studied, however, more for the sake of seeing what a great man does to order when he is wearied of what is required from him, than for its own merit. St. George and the Princess. There are, besides the Paradise, only 6 pictures in the Ducal Palace, as far as I know, which Tintoret painted carefully, and those are all exceedingly fine. The most finished of these are in the Anti-Collegio, but those that are most majestic and characteristic of the master are 2 oblong ones, made to fill the panels of the walls in the Anti-Chisetta. These 2 each, I suppose about 8 feet by 6, are in his most quiet and noble manner. There is excessively little colour in them, their prevalent tone being a greyish-brown opposed with grey, black, and a very warm russet. They are thinly painted, perfect in tone, and quite 302 untouched. The first of them is St. George and the Dragon, the subject being treated in a new and curious way. The principal figure is the princess, who sits astride on the dragon's neck, holding him by a bridle of silken riband. St. George stands above and behind her, holding his hands over her head as if to bless her, or to keep the dragon quiet by heavenly power, and a monk stands by on the right, looking gravely on. There is no expression or life in the dragon, though the white flashes in its eye are very ghastly, but the whole thing is entirely typical, and the princess is not so much represented riding on the dragon as supposed to be placed by St. George in an attitude of perfect victory over her chief enemy. She has a full rich dress of dull red, but her figure is somewhat ungraceful. St. George is in grey armour and grey drapery, and has a beautiful face, his figure entirely dark against the distant sky. There is a study for this picture in the Manfrini Palace. St. Andrew and St. Jerome. This, the companion picture, has even less colour than its opposite. It is nearly all brown and grey, the fig leaves and olive leaves brown, the face is brown, the dress is brown, and St. Andrew holding a great brown cross. There is nothing that can be called colour, except the grey of the sky, which approaches in some places a little to blue, and a single piece of dirty brick-red in St. Jerome's dress. And yet Tintoret's greatness hardly ever shows more than in the management of such sober tints. I would rather have these 2 small brown pictures, and 2 others in the Academy perfectly brown also in their general tone of Cain and Abel, and the Adam and Eve, than all the other small pictures in Venice put together, which he painted in bright colours for altar pieces. But I never saw 2 pictures which so nearly approached grisaille as these, and yet were delicious pieces of colour. I do not know if I am right in calling one of the saints St. Andrew. He stands holding a great upright wooden cross against the sky. St. Jerome reclines at his feet, against a rock, over which some glorious fig leaves and olive branches are shooting, every line of them studied with the most exquisite care, and yet cast with perfect freedom. Bacchus and Ariadne, the most beautiful of the 303 careful pictures by Tintoret, which occupy the angles of the Anti-Collegio. Once one of the noblest pictures in the world, but now miserably faded, the sun being allowed to fall on it all day long. The design of the forms of the leafage round the head of the Bacchus, and the floating grace of the female figure above, will, however, always give interest to this picture, unless it be repainted. The other 3 Tintorets in this room are careful and fine, but far inferior to the Bacchus, and the Vulcan and the Cyclops is a singularly meagre and vulgar study of common models. Europa by Paul Veronese, in the same room, one of the very few pictures which both possess and deserve a high reputation. Venice enthroned by Paul Veronese, on the roof of the same room, one of the grandest pieces of frank colour in the Ducal Palace. Venice and the Doge Sebastian Venia, at the upper end of the Sala del Collegio, an unrivalled Paul Veronese, far finer even than the Europa. Marriage of St. Catherine by Tintoret, in the same room, an inferior picture, but the figure of St. Catherine is quite exquisite. Note how her veil falls over her form, showing the sky through it, as an alpine cascade falls over a marble rock. There are 3 other Tintorets on the walls of this room, but all inferior though full of power. Note especially the painting of the lion's wings, and of the coloured carpet in the one nearest the throne, the Doge Alvise Mosnigo adoring the Redeemer. The roof is entirely by Paul Veronese, and the traveller who really loves painting ought to get leave to come to this room whenever he chooses, and should pass the sunny summer mornings there again and again, wandering now and then into the Anti-Collegio and Sala dei Pregadi, and coming back to rest under the wings of the couched lion at the feet of the Mosnigo. He will no otherwise enter so deeply into the heart of Venice. 8. Imo Palazzo on the Grand Canal, of no interest. Erizzo Palazzo near the Arsenal, Roman II. Erizzo Palazzo on the Grand Canal, nearly opposite the Fondaco de Turce, a Gothic palace with a single range of windows founded on the ducal traceries and bold capitals. It has been above referred to in the notice of tracery bars. Euphemia, Church of St. A, small and defaced, but very curious early Gothic church on the Giudecca. Not worth visiting, unless the traveller is seriously interested in architecture. Europa Albergo All, once a Giustiniani palace, good Gothic circa 1400 but much altered. Evangelisti, Casa Digli, Roman II. 12. Capitals of Fondaco de Turce. Capitals of Fondaco de Turce. F. Faccanin Palazzo alla Fava, a fair example of the 15th century Gothic, founded on ducal palace. Falia Palazzo at the Apostoli, above Roman II. Fantino Church of St., said to contain a John Bellini, otherwise of no importance. Farsetti Palazzo on the Grand Canal II, 393. Fava Church of St. of no importance. Felis Church of St. said to contain a tintoret, which if untouched I should conjecture from Lazarus' statement of its subject, St. Demetrius armed with one of the Gissi family in prayer must be very fine. Otherwise the church is of no importance. Ferro Palazzo on the Grand Canal, 15th century Gothic, very hard and bad. Flangini Palazzo on the Grand Canal, of no importance. Fondaco de Turce 1, 2, 121, 236. The opposite plate representing three of its capitals has been several times referred to. Fondaco de Tedeschi, a huge and ugly building near the Rialto, rendered, however, peculiarly interesting by remnants of the frescoes by Giorgione with which it was once covered. See Val, 2 and Roman 3. Formosa Church of Santa Maria, 3, 122. Fosca Church of St. notable for its exceedingly picturesque campanile, of late Gothic, but uninjured by restorations, and peculiarly Venetian in being crowned by the cupola instead of the pyramid, which would have been employed at the same period in any other Italian city. Foscari Palazzo on the Grand Canal, the noblest example in Venice of the 15th century Gothic, founded on the ducal palace but lately restored and spoiled, all but the stonework of the main windows. The restoration was necessary, however, for when I was in Venice in 1845, this palace was a foul ruin, its great hall a mass of mud, used as a back receptacle of a stonemason's yard, and its rooms whitewashed and scribbled over with indecent caricatures. It has since been partially strengthened and put in order, but as the Venetian municipality have now given it to the Austrians to be used as barracks, it will probably soon be reduced to its former condition. The lower palaces at the side of this building are said by some to have belonged to the younger Foscari. See Giustiniani. Francesco della Vigna, Church of St. Base Renaissance, but must be visited in order to see the John Bellini in the Cappella Santa. The late sculpture in the Cappella Giustiniani appears from Lazarus' statement to be deserving of careful study. This church is said also to contain two pictures by Paul Veronese. Frari Church of the, founded in 1250 and continued at various subsequent periods. The apse and adjoining chapels are the earliest portions, and their traceries have been above notice too, as the origin of those of the ducal palace. The best view of the apse, which is a very noble example of Italian Gothic, is from the door of the Scuola di San Rocco. The doors of the church are all later than any other portion of it, very elaborate Renaissance Gothic. The interior is good Gothic, but not interesting except in its monuments. Of these, the following are noticed in the text of this volume. that of Duccio degli Alberti at pages 74-80, of the Unknown Knight opposite that of Duccio 3, of Francesco Foscari 3, of Giovanni Pesaro 91, of Jacopo Pesaro 92. Besides these tombs, the traveller ought to notice carefully that of Pietro Bernardo, a first-rate example of Renaissance work. Nothing can be more detestable or mindless in general design, or more beautiful in execution. Examine especially the griffins, fixed in admiration of bouquets at the bottom. The fruit and flowers which arrest the attention of the griffins may well arrest the travellers also. Nothing can be finer of their kind. The tomb of Canova by Canova cannot be missed. Consummate in science, intolerable in affectation, ridiculous in conception, null and void to the uttermost in invention and feeling. The equestrian statue of Paolo Savelli is spirited. The monument of the Beato Pacifico, a curious example of Renaissance Gothic with wild crockets all in terra cotta. There are several good Vivarinis in the church, but its chief pictorial treasure is the John Bellini in the sacristy, the most finished and delicate example of the master in Venice. G. Geremia, Church of St. of no importance. Gesuati, Church of no importance. Giacomo Delorio, Church of St., a most interesting church of the early 13th century but grievously restored. Its capitals have been already noticed as characteristic of the earliest Gothic, and it is said to contain 4 works of Paul Veronese, but I have not examined them. The pulpit is admired by the Italians but is utterly worthless. The verdantique pillar in the south transept is a very noble example of the jewel shaft. See the note at Vol. 2. Giacomo di Rialto, Church of St. A picturesque little church on the Piazza di Rialto. It has been grievously restored, but the pillars and capitals of its nave are certainly of the 11th century. Those of its portico are of good central Gothic, and it will surely not be left unvisited, on this ground if on no other that it stands on the site, and still retains the name, of the first church ever built on that Rialto which formed the nucleus of future Venice, and became afterwards the mart of her merchants. Giobbe, Church of St. near the Cana Reggio. Its principal entrance is a very fine example of early Renaissance sculpture. 307 note in it, especially, its beautiful use of the flower of the convolvulus. There are said to be still more beautiful examples of the same period, in the interior. The cloister, though much defaced, is of the Gothic period, and worth a glance. Giorgio de Greci, Church of St. the Greek Church. It contains no valuable objects of art, but its service is worth attending by those who have never seen the Greek ritual. Giorgio de Schiavone, Church of St., said to contain a very precious series of paintings by Victor Carpaccio, otherwise of no interest. Giorgio in Aliga St. George in the Seaweed, Church of St., unimportant in itself, but the most beautiful view of Venice at sunset is from a point at about 2/3 of the distance from the city to the island. Giorgio Maggiore, Church of St. A building which owes its interesting effect chiefly to its isolated position, being seen over a great space of lagoon. The traveller should especially notice in its facade the manner in which the central Renaissance architects of whose style this church is a renowned example, endeavoured to fit the laws they had established to the requirements of their age. Churches were required with aisles and clerestories, that is to say, with a high central nave and lower wings, and the question was how to face this form with pillars of one proportion. The noble Romanesque architects built story above story, as at Pisa and Lucca, but the base Palladian architects dared not do this. They must needs retain some image of the Greek temple, but the Greek temple was all of one height, a low gable roof being borne on ranges of equal pillars. So the Palladian builders raised first a Greek temple with pilasters for shafts, and through the middle of its roof or horizontal beam, that is to say, of the cornice which externally represented this beam, they lifted another temple on pedestals, adding these barbarous appendages to the shafts, which otherwise would not have been high enough, fragments of the divided cornice or tie-beam being left between the shafts, and the great door of the church thrust in between the pedestals. It is impossible to conceive a design more gross, more barbarous, more childish in conception, more 308 servile in plagiarism, more insipid in result, more contemptible under every point of rational regard. Observe also that when Palladio had got his pediment at the top of the church, he did not know what to do with it. He had no idea of decorating it except by a round hole in the middle. The traveller should compare, both in construction and decoration, the Church of the Redentor with this of San Giorgio. Now, a dark penetration is often a most precious assistance to a building dependent upon colour for its effect, for a cavity is the only means in the architect's power of obtaining certain and vigorous shadow. And for this purpose, a circular penetration, surrounded by a deep russet marble moulding, is beautifully used in the centre of the white field on the side of the portico of St. Mark's, but Palladio had given up colour and pierced his pediment with a circular cavity, merely because he had not wit enough to fill it with sculpture. The interior of the church is like a large assembly room, and would have been undeserving of a moment's attention, but that it contains some most precious pictures, namely, Gathering the Manna, on the left hand of the high altar, one of Tintoret's most remarkable landscapes, a brook flowing through a mountainous country, studded with thickets and palm trees. The congregation have been long in the wilderness, and are employed in various manufactures much more than in gathering the manna. One group is forging, another grinding manna in a mill, another making shoes, one woman making a piece of dress, some washing, the main purpose of Tintoret being evidently to indicate the continuity of the supply of heavenly food. Another painter would have made the congregation hurrying to gather it, and wondering at it. Tintoret at once makes us remember that they have been fed with it by the space of 40 years. It is a large picture, full of interest and power but scattered in effect, and not striking except from its elaborate landscape. The Last Supper, opposite the former, these two pictures have been painted for their places, the subjects being illustrative of the sacrifice of the Mass. This latter is remarkable for its entire homeliness in the general treatment of the subject, the entertainment being represented like any large 309 supper in a second-rate Italian inn, the figures being all comparatively uninteresting. But we are reminded that the subject is a sacred one, not only by the strong light shining from the head of Christ, but because the smoke of the lamp which hangs over the table turns, as it rises, into a multitude of angels, all painted in grey, the colour of the smoke, and so writhed and twisted together that the eye hardly at first distinguishes them from the vapour out of which they are formed, ghosts of countenances and filmy wings filling up the intervals between the completed heads. The idea is highly characteristic of the master. The picture has been grievously injured, but still shows miracles of skill in the expression of candlelight mixed with twilight, variously reflected rays, and half-tones of the dimly lighted chamber, mingled with the beams of the lantern and those from the head of Christ, flashing along the metal and glass upon the table, and under it along the floor, and dying away into the recesses of the room. Martyrdom of various saints, altar-piece of the third altar in the south aisle, a moderately sized picture, and now a very disagreeable one, owing to the violent red into which the colour that formed the glory of the angel at the top is changed. It has been hastily painted, and only shows the artist's power in the energy of the figure of an executioner drawing a bow, and in the magnificent ease with which the other figures are thrown together in all manner of wild groups and defiances of probability. Stones and arrows are flying about in the air at random. Coronation of the Virgin, fourth altar in the same aisle, painted more for the sake of the portraits at the bottom than of the Virgin at the top. A good picture, but somewhat tame for Tintoret and much injured. The principal figure in black is still, however, very fine. Resurrection of Christ, at the end of the north aisle in the chapel beside the choir. Another picture painted chiefly for the sake of the included portraits, and remarkably cold in general conception. Its colour has, however, been gay and delicate, lilac, yellow and blue being largely used in it. The flag which our Saviour bears in his hand has been once 310 as bright as the sail of a Venetian fishing boat, but the colours are now all chilled, and the picture is rather crude than brilliant, a mere wreck of what it was, and all covered with droppings of wax at the bottom. Martyrdom of St. Stephen altar-piece in the north transept. The saint is in a rich prelate's dress, looking as if he had just been saying Mass, kneeling in the foreground and perfectly serene. The stones are flying about him like hail, and the ground is covered with them as thickly as if it were a river bed. But in the midst of them, at the saint's right hand, there is a book lying, crushed but open, 2 or 3 stones which have torn one of its leaves lying upon it. The freedom and ease with which the leaf is crumpled is just as characteristic of the master as any of the grander features. No one but Tintoret could have so crushed a leaf, but the idea is still more characteristic of him, for the book is evidently meant for the mosaic history which Stephen had just been expounding, and its being crushed by the stones, shows how the blind rage of the Jews was violating their own law in the murder of Stephen. In the upper part of the picture are three figures, Christ, the Father, and St. Michael. Christ, of course, at the right hand of the Father, as Stephen saw him standing, but there is little dignity in this part of the conception. In the middle of the picture, which is also the middle distance, are 3 or 4 men throwing stones, with Tintoret's usual vigour of gesture, and behind them an immense and confused crowd, so that at first we wonder where St. Paul is, but presently we observe that in the front of this crowd, and almost exactly in the centre of the picture, there is a figure seated on the ground, very noble and quiet, and with some loose garments thrown across its knees. It is dressed in vigorous black and red. The figure of the Father in the sky above is dressed in black and red also, and these two figures are the centres of colour to the whole design. It is almost impossible to praise too highly the refinement of conception which withdrew the unconverted St. Paul into the distance, so as entirely to separate him from the immediate interest of the scene, and yet mark the dignity to which he was afterward to be raised, by investing him with the colours 311, which occurred nowhere else in the picture, except in the dress which veils the form of the Godhead. It is also to be noted as an interesting example of the value which the painter put upon colour only. Another composer would have thought it necessary to exalt the future apostle by some peculiar dignity of action or expression. The posture of the figure is indeed grand, but inconspicuous. Tintoret does not depend upon it, and thinks that the figure is quite ennobled enough by being made a keynote of colour. It is also worth observing how boldly imaginative is the treatment which covers the ground with piles of stones, and yet leaves the martyr apparently unwounded. Another painter would have covered him with blood, and elaborated the expression of pain upon his countenance. Tintoret leaves us under no doubt as to what manner of death he is dying. He makes the air hurtle with the stones, but he does not choose to make his picture disgusting or even painful. The face of the martyr is serene and exulting, and we leave the picture remembering only how he fell asleep. Giovanelli Palazzo at the Pont di Nole, a fine example of 15th-century Gothic, founded on the Ducal Palace. Giovanni e Paolo, Church of St. Foundation of, Roman 3, an impressive church, though none of its Gothic is comparable with that of the north, or with that of Verona. The western door is interesting as one of the last conditions of Gothic design passing into Renaissance, very rich and beautiful of its kind, especially the wreath of fruit and flowers which forms its principal moulding. The statue of Bartolomeo Colleone in the little square beside the church is certainly one of the noblest works in Italy. I have never seen anything approaching it in animation, in vigour of portraiture, or nobleness of line. The reader will need Lazarus' guide in making the circuit of the church, which is full of interesting monuments, but I wish especially to direct his attention to 2 pictures, besides the celebrated Peter Martyr, namely, the Crucifixion by Tintoret, on the wall of the left-hand aisle just before turning into the transept, a picture 15 feet long by 11 or 12 high. I do not believe that either the Miracle of St. Mark or the Great Crucifixion in the Scuola di San Rocco cost Tintoret more pains than this comparatively small work, which is now utterly neglected, covered with filth and cobwebs and fearfully injured. As a piece of colour and light and shade, it is altogether marvellous. Of all the 50 figures which the picture contains, there is not one which in any way injures or contends with another. Nay, there is not a single fold of garment or touch of the pencil which could be spared. Every virtue of Tintoret as a painter is there in its highest degree, colour at once the most intense and the most delicate, the utmost decision in the arrangement of masses of light, and yet half-tones and modulations of endless variety, and all executed with a magnificence of handling which no words are energetic enough to describe. I have hardly ever seen a picture in which there was so much decision, and so little impetuosity, and in which so little was conceded to haste, to accident, or to weakness. It is too infinite a work to be describable, but among its minor passages of extreme beauty should especially be noticed the manner in which the accumulated forms of the human body, which fill the picture from end to end, are prevented from being felt heavy by the grace and elasticity of 2 or 3 sprays of leafage which spring from a broken root in the foreground, and rise conspicuous in shadow against an interstice filled by the pale blue, grey, and golden light in which the distant crowd is invested, the office of this foliage being, in an artistical point of view, correspondent to that of the trees set by the sculptors of the Ducal Palace on its angles. But they have a far more important meaning in the picture than any artistical one. If the spectator will look carefully at the root which I have called broken, he will find that in reality it is not broken, but cut, the other branches of the young tree having lately been cut away. When we remember that one of the principal incidents in Great San Rocco crucifixion is the ass feeding on withered palm leaves, we shall be at no loss to understand the great painter's purpose in lifting 313, the branch of this mutilated olive, against the dim light of the distant sky, while close beside it St. Joseph of Arimathea drags along the dust a white garment. Observe the principal light of the picture, stained with the blood of that king before whom, 5 days before, his crucifiers had strewn their own garments in the way. Our Lady with the Camerlengi, in the centre chapel of the three on the right of the choir, a remarkable instance of the theoretical manner of representing scriptural facts, which at this time, as noted in the 2nd chapter of this volume, was undermining the belief of the facts themselves. 3 Venetian chamberlains desired to have their portraits painted, and at the same time to express their devotion to the Madonna. To that end they are painted kneeling before her, and in order to account for their all three being together, and to give a thread or clue to the story of the picture, they are represented as the 3 Magi. But lest the spectator should think it strange that the Magi should be in the dress of Venetian chamberlains, the scene is marked as a mere ideality. By surrounding the person of the Virgin with saints who lived 500 years after her, she has for attendants St. Theodore, St. Sebastian, and St. Carlo Quiri St. Joseph. One hardly knows whether most to regret the spirit, which was losing sight of the verities of religious history in imaginative abstractions, or to praise the modesty and piety which desired rather to be represented as kneeling before the Virgin than in the discharge, or among the insignia of important offices of state. As an adoration of the Magi, the picture is, of course, sufficiently absurd. The St. Sebastian leans back in the corner to be out of the way. The 3 Magi kneel without the slightest appearance of emotion to a Madonna seated in a Venetian loggia of the 15th century, and 3 Venetian servants behind bear their offerings in a very homely sack, tied up at the mouth. As a piece of portraiture and artistical composition, the work is altogether perfect, perhaps the best piece of Tintoret's portrait painting in existence. It is very carefully and steadily wrought, and arranged with consummate skill on a difficult plan. The canvas is a long oblong, I 314 think about 18 or 20 feet long, by about 7 high. One might almost fancy the painter had been puzzled to bring the piece into use, the figures being all thrown into positions which a little diminish their height. The nearest chamberlain is kneeling, the 2 behind him bowing themselves slightly, the attendants behind bowing lower, the Madonna sitting, the St. Theodore sitting still lower on the steps at her feet, and the St. Sebastian leaning back, so that all the lines of the picture incline more or less from right to left as they ascend. This slope, which gives unity to the detached groups, is carefully exhibited by what a mathematician would call coordinates, the upright pillars of the loggia and the horizontal clouds of the beautiful sky. The color is very quiet but rich and deep, the local tones being brought out with intense force and the cast shadows subdued, the manner being much more that of Titian than of Tintoret. The sky appears full of light, though it is as dark as the flesh of the faces, and the forms of its floating clouds as well as of the hills over which they rise are drawn with a deep remembrance of reality. There are hundreds of pictures of Tintoret's more amazing than this, but I hardly know one that I more love. The reader ought especially to study the sculpture round the altar of the Cappella del Rosario, as an example of the abuse of the sculptor's art, every accessory being laboured out with as much ingenuity and intense effort to turn sculpture into painting, the grass, trees and landscape being as far realised as possible, and in alto levo. These bas-reliefs are by various artists, and therefore exhibit the folly of the age, not the error of an individual. The following alphabetical list of the tombs in this church which are alluded to as described in the text, with references to the pages where they are mentioned, will save some trouble. Cavalli Jacopo, Roman 3. Cornaro Marco, Roman 3. Dolphin Giovanni, Roman 3. Giustiniani Marco, Roman 1. Mosnigo Giovanni, Roman 3. Mosnigo Pietro, Roman 3. Mosnigo Tommaso 126, Roman 3. Morosini Michel, Roman 3. Steno Michel, Roman 3. Vendramin Andrea 1, Roman 3. Giovanni Grisostomo, Church of St. one of the most important in Venice. It is early Renaissance, containing some good sculpture, but chiefly notable as containing a noble Sebastian del Piombo, and a John Bellini which a few years hence, unless it be restored, will be esteemed one of the most precious pictures in Italy, and among the most perfect in the world. John Bellini is the only artist who appears to me to have united, in equal and magnificent measures, justness of drawing, nobleness of colouring, and perfect manliness of treatment, with the purest religious feeling. He did, as far as it is possible to do it instinctively and unaffectedly, what the Carracci only pretended to do. Titian colours better but has not his piety. Leonardo draws better but has not his colour. Angelico is more heavenly, but has not his manliness, far less his powers of art. Giovanni Elemocenario, Church of St. said to contain a Titian and a Bonifacio, of no other interest. Giovanni Imbragola, Church of St. a Gothic church of the 14th century, small but interesting, and said to contain some precious works by Cima da Conegliano, and one by John Bellini. Giovanni Novo, Church of St. of no importance. Giovanni S. Scuola 501, a fine example of the Byzantine Renaissance, mixed with remnants of good late Gothic. The little exterior cortile is sweet in feeling, and Lazzari praises highly the work of the interior staircase. Giudecca, the crescent-shaped island or series of islands, which forms the most northern extremity of the city of Venice, though separated by a broad channel from the main city. Commonly said to derive its name from the number of Jews who lived upon it, but Lazzari derives it from the word giudicato, in Venetian dialect giudega, it having been in old time adjudged as a kind of prison territory to the more dangerous and turbulent citizens. It is now inhabited only by the poor, and covered by desolate groups of miserable dwellings, divided by stagnant canals. Its two principal churches, the Redentor and St. Euphemia, are named in their alphabetical order. Giuliano, Church of St. of no importance. Giuseppe di Castello, Church of St. said to contain a Pole Veronese, otherwise of no importance. Giustina, Church of St. of no importance. Giustiniani Palazzo on the Grand Canal, now Albergo all Europa, good late 14th century Gothic, but much altered. Giustiniani Palazzo next the Casa Foscari on the Grand Canal. Lazzari, I know not on what authority, says that this palace was built by the Giustiniani family before 1428. It is one of those founded directly on the ducal palace, together with the Casa Foscari at its side, and there could have been no doubt of their date on this ground, but it would be interesting, after what we have seen of the progress of the ducal palace, to ascertain the exact year of the erection of any of these imitations. Full of tracery, of which the profiles are given in the appendix, under the title of the Palace of the Younger Foscari, it being popularly reported to have belonged to the son of the Doge. Giustinian Lalin Palazzo on the Grand Canal, of no importance. Grassi Palazzo on the Grand Canal, now Albergo all Imperator di Austria, of no importance. Gregorio, Church of St. on the Grand Canal, an important church of the 14th century, now desecrated but still interesting. Its apse is on the little canal crossing from the Grand Canal to the Giudecca, beside the Church of the Salute, and is very characteristic of the rude ecclesiastical Gothic contemporary with the ducal palace. The entrance to its cloisters from the Grand Canal is somewhat later, a noble square door with two windows on each side of it, the grandest examples in Venice of the late window of the fourth order. The cloister, to which this door gives entrance, is exactly contemporary with the finest work of the ducal palace, circa 1350. It is the loveliest cortile I know in Venice, its capitals consummate in design and execution, and the low wall on which they stand showing remnants of sculpture unique, as far as I know, in such application. Grimani Palazzo on the Grand Canal, Roman 3. There are several other palaces in Venice belonging to this family, but none of any architectural interest. Jesuiti, Church of the basest Renaissance, but worth a visit in order to examine the imitations of curtains in white marble, inlaid with green. It contains a Tintoret, the Assumption, which I have not examined, and a Titian, the Martyrdom of St. Lawrence, originally, it seems to me, of little value, and now, having been restored, of none else. Labia Palazzo on the Canna Reggio, of no importance. Lazzaro de Mendicanti, Church of St. of no importance. Libreria Vecchia, a graceful building of the Central Renaissance, designed by Sansovino, 1536, and much admired by all architects of the school. It was continued by Scamozzi, down the whole side of St. Mark's Place, adding another story above it, which modern critics blame as destroying the eurythmia, never considering that had the two low stories of the library been continued along the entire length of the piazza, they would have looked so low that the entire dignity of the square would have been lost. As it is, the library is left in its originally good proportions, and the larger mass of the Procure di Nuove forms a more majestic, though less graceful, side for the great square. But the real faults of the building are not in its number of stories, but in the design of the parts. It is one of the grossest examples of the base Renaissance habit of turning keystones into brackets, throwing them out in bold projection not less than 1.5 feet beyond the mouldings of the arch, a practice utterly barbarous, inasmuch as it evidently tends to dislocate the entire arch, if any real weight were laid on the extremity of the keystone. And it is also a very characteristic example of the vulgar and painful mode of filling spandrels by naked figures in alto levo, leaning against the arch on 318 each side, and appearing as if they were continually in danger of slipping off. Many of these figures have, however, some merit in themselves, and the whole building is graceful and effective of its kind. The continuation of the Procure di Nuove, at the western extremity of St. Mark's Place, together with various apartments in the great line of the Procure di Nuove, forms the Royal Palace, the residence of the Emperor when at Venice. This building is entirely modern, built in 1810, in imitation of the Procure di Nuove, and on the site of Sansovino's Church of San Geminiano. In this range of buildings, including the Royal Palace, the Procure di Nuove, the Old Library, and the Zecca which is connected with them, the latter being an ugly building of very modern date, not worth notice architecturally, there are many most valuable pictures, among which I would especially direct attention, first to those in the Zecca, namely, a beautiful and strange Madonna by Benedetto Diana, two noble Bonifazios, and two groups by Tintoret of the Provveditore della Zecca, by no means to be missed, whatever may be sacrificed to see them, on account of the quietness and veracity of their unaffected portraiture, and the absolute freedom from all vanity either in the painter or in his subjects. Next, in the antesala of the Old Library, observe the Sapienza of Titian in the centre of the ceiling, a most interesting work in the light brilliancy of its colour and the resemblance to Paul Veronese. Then, in the great hall of the Old Library, examine the two large Tintorets, St. Mark saving a Saracen from drowning, and the stealing of his body from Constantinople, both rude, but great note in the latter the dashing of the rain on the pavement, and running of the water about the feet of the figures. Then in the narrow spaces between the windows, there are some magnificent single figures by Tintoret, among the finest things of the kind in Italy or in Europe. Finally, in the gallery of pictures in the Palazzo Reale, among other good works of various kinds, are two of the most interesting Bonifazios in Venice, the children of Israel in their journeyings, in one of which, if I recollect right, the quails are coming in flight across a sunset sky, forming one of the earliest instances I know of a 319 thoroughly natural and Turneresque effect. Being felt and rendered by the old masters, the picture struck me chiefly from this circumstance, but the notebook in which I had described it and its companion having been lost on my way home, I cannot now give a more special account of them, except that they are long, full of crowded figures, and peculiarly light in colour and handling, as compared with Bonifazio's work in general. Leo, Church of St. of no importance, but said to contain a spoiled Titian. Leo Salizardo di St. Windows in, 257. Lourdes Palazzo on the Grand Canal near the Rialto, 393. Another palace of this name on the Campo St. Stefano is of no importance. Lorenzo, Church of St. of no importance. Lucca, Church of St. Its campanile is a very interesting and quaint early Gothic, and it is said to contain a Paul Veronese St. Luke and the Virgin. In the little Campiello St. Lucca, close by, is a very precious Gothic door, rich in brickwork of the 13th century. and in the foundations of the houses on the same side of the square, but at the other end of it, are traceable some shafts and arches closely resembling the work of the Cathedral of Murano, and evidently having once belonged to some most interesting building. Lucia, Church of St. of no importance. Madilna, Church of Star, Maria of no importance. Malipiro Palazzo on the Campo St. 1000, Formosa, facing the canal at its extremity, a very beautiful example of the Byzantine Renaissance. Note the management of colour in its inlaid balconies. Manfrini Palazzo, the architecture is of no interest, and as it is in contemplation to allow the collection of pictures to be sold, I shall take no note of them. But even if they should remain, there are few of the churches in Venice where the traveller had not better spend his time than in this gallery, as with the exception of Titian's Entombment, 1 or 2 Giorgionis, and the little John Bellini St. Jerome, the pictures are all of a kind which may be seen elsewhere. Mengele Valmarena Palazzo on the Grand Canal, of no importance. Manin Palazzo on the Grand Canal, of no importance. Manzoni Palazzo on the Grand Canal, near the Church of the Carita, a perfect and very rich example of Byzantine Renaissance. Its warm yellow marbles are magnificent. Marsilian Church of St., said to contain a Titian, Tobit and the Angel, otherwise of no importance. Maria Churches of Star, see Formosa, Mater Domini Miracoli Orto, Salute and Zobnigo. Marco Scuola di San, Roman 3. Mark Church of St., History of 2, Approach to 2, General Teaching of 2, 116, Measures of Facade of 2, Balustrades 2, 247, Cornices of 1, Horseshoe Arches of 2, Entrances of 2, 3, Shafts of 2, Base in Baptistry of 1, Mosaics in Atrium of 2. Mosaics in cupola of 2, 3, lily capitals of 2, plates illustrative of Vol. 2, 6, 7, Figs, 9, 10, 11, 8, Figs, 8, 9, 12, 13, 15, 9, 11, Fig, 1 and Plate 3, Vol. 3, Mark Square of St. Piazza di San Marco, anciently a garden 2, general effect of 2, 116, plan of Roman 2. Martino, Church of St. of no importance. Mater Domini, Church of St. Maria. It contains 2 important pictures, one over the second altar on the right, St. Christina by Vincenzo Catena, a very lovely example of the Venetian religious school, and over the north transept door, the Finding of the Cross by Tintoret, a carefully painted and attractive picture, but by no means a good specimen of the master as far as regards power of conception. He does not seem to have entered into his subject. There is no wonder, no rapture, no entire devotion in any of the figures. They are only interested and pleased in a mild way, and the kneeling woman who hands the nails to a man stooping forward to receive them on the right hand, does so with the air of a person saying, "You had better take care of them. They may be wanted another time." This general coldness in expression is much increased by the presence of several figures on the right and left, introduced for the sake of portraiture merely, and 321, the reality, as well as the feeling, of the scene is destroyed by our seeing one of the youngest and weakest of the women with a huge cross lying across her knees, the whole weight of it resting upon her. As might have been expected where the conception is so languid, the execution is little delighted in. It is throughout steady and powerful, but in no place affectionate and in no place impetuous. If Tintoret had always painted in this way, he would have sunk into a mere mechanist. It is, however, a genuine and tolerably well-preserved specimen, and its female figures are exceedingly graceful, that of St. Helena very queenly, though by no means agreeable in feature. Among the male portraits on the left, there is one different from the usual types which occur either in Venetian paintings or Venetian populace. It is carefully painted, and more like a Scotch Presbyterian minister than a Greek. The background is chiefly composed of architecture, white, remarkably uninteresting in colour, and still more so in form. This is to be noticed as one of the unfortunate results of the Renaissance teaching at this period. Had Tintoret backed his Empress Helena with Byzantine architecture, the picture might have been one of the most gorgeous he ever painted. Mater Domini, Campo di Sta. Maria, Roman 2, a most interesting little piazza, surrounded by early Gothic houses, once of singular beauty. The arcade at its extremity of 4th-order windows drawn in my folio work is one of the earliest and loveliest of its kind in Venice. and in the houses at the side is a group of second-order windows with their intermediate crosses, all complete and well worth careful examination. Michele in Isola, Church of St. on the island between Venice and Murano. The little Cappella Emiliana at the side of it has been much admired, but it would be difficult to find a building more feelingless or ridiculous. It is more like a German summer house or angle turret than a chapel, and may be briefly described as a beehive set on a low hexagonal tower, with dashes of stonework about its windows like the flourishes of an idle penman. The cloister of this church is pretty, and the attached cemetery is worth entering, for the sake of feeling the 322 strangeness of the quiet sleeping ground in the midst of the sea. Michele dal Carlone Palazzo, of no importance. Minelli Palazzo, in the Court del Maltese at St. Paternian. It has a spiral external staircase, very picturesque, but of the 15th century and without merit. Miracali Church of Star, Maria Dei, the most interesting and finished example in Venice of the Byzantine Renaissance, and one of the most important in Italy of the Cinquecento style. All its sculptures should be examined with great care, as the best possible examples of a bad style. Observe, for instance, that in spite of the beautiful work on the square pillars which support the gallery at the west end, they have no more architectural effect than two wooden posts. The same kind of failure in boldness of purpose exists throughout, and the building is in fact rather a small museum of unmeaning, though refined sculpture, than a piece of architecture. Its grotesques are admirable examples of the base Raphaelesque design examined above. Roman III note, especially the children's heads tied up by the hair, in the lateral sculptures at the top of the altar steps. A rude workman who could hardly have carved the head at all might have allowed this or any other mode of expressing discontent with his own doings, but the man who could carve a child's head so perfectly must have been wanting in all human feeling to cut it off and tie it by the hair to a vine leaf. Observe, in the ducal palace, though far ruder in skill, the heads always emerge from the leaves, they are never tied to them. Misericordia Church of. The church itself is nothing, and contains nothing worth the traveller's time, but the albergo de Confratelli della Misericordia at its side is a very interesting and beautiful relic of the Gothic Renaissance. Lazari says del Secolo XIV, but I believe it to be later. Its traceries are very curious and rich, and the sculpture of its capitals very fine for the late time. Close to it, on the right-hand side of the canal which is crossed by the wooden bridge, is one of the richest Gothic doors in Venice, remarkable for the appearance of antiquity in the general design and stiffness of its figures, 323 though it bears its date 1505. Its extravagant crockets are almost the only features which, but for this written date, would at first have confessed its lateness. But on examination, the figures will be found as bad and spiritless as they are apparently archaic, and completely exhibiting the Renaissance palsy of imagination. The general effect is, however, excellent, the whole arrangement having been borrowed from earlier work. The action of the statue of the Madonna, who extends her robe to shelter a group of diminutive figures, representative of the society for whose house the sculpture was executed, may be also seen in most of the later Venetian figures of the Virgin which occupy similar situations. The image of Christ is placed in a medallion on her breast, thus fully, though conventionally, expressing the idea of self-support, which is so often partially indicated by the great religious painters in their representations of the infant Jesus. Moy's Church of St. Roman III, notable as one of the basest examples of the basest school of the Renaissance. It contains one important picture, namely Christ washing the disciples' feet by Tintoret, on the left side of the chapel, north of the choir. This picture has been originally dark, is now much faded in parts, I believe, altogether destroyed, and is hung in the worst light of a chapel, where, on a sunny day at noon, one could not easily read without a candle. I cannot, therefore, give much information respecting it, but it is certainly one of the least successful of the painter's works, and both careless and unsatisfactory in its composition, as well as its colour. One circumstance is noticeable, as in a considerable degree detracting from the interest of most of Tintoret's representations of our Saviour with his disciples. He never loses sight of the fact that all were poor, and the latter ignorant, and while he never paints a senator or a saint once thoroughly canonized, except as a gentleman, he is very careful to paint the apostles, in their living intercourse with the Saviour, in such a manner that the spectator may see in an instant, as the Pharisee did of old, that they were unlearned and ignorant men. And whenever we find them in a room, it is always such a one as would be inhabited by the lower classes. 324. There seems some violation of this practice in the dais, or flight of steps, at the top of which the Saviour is placed in the present picture. But we are quickly reminded that the guest's chamber or upper room ready prepared was not likely to have been in a palace, by the humble furniture upon the floor, consisting of a tub with a copper saucepan in it, a coffee pot, and a pair of bellows, curiously associated with a symbolic cup with a wafer, which, however, is in an injured part of the canvas, and may have been added by the priests. I am totally unable to state what the background of the picture is or has been, and the only point farther to be noted about it is the solemnity, which, in spite of the familiar and homely circumstances above noticed, the painter has given to the scene, by placing the Saviour, in the act of washing the feet of Peter, at the top of a circle of steps, on which the other apostles kneel in adoration and astonishment. Moro Palazzo, see Othello. Morosini Palazzo, near the Ponte dell'Ospedaleto, at San Giovanni Paolo. Outside it is not interesting, though the gateway shows remains of brickwork of the 13th century. Its interior court is singularly beautiful. The staircase of early 14th century Gothic has originally been superb, and the window in the angle above is the most perfect that I know in Venice of the kind. The lightly sculptured coronet is exquisitely introduced at the top of its spiral shaft. This palace still belongs to the Morosini family, to whose present representative, the Count Carlo Morosini, the reader is indebted for the note on the character of his ancestors, above Roman 3. Morosini Palazzo at St. Stefano, of no importance. And Nanni Mosnigo Palazzo, now Hotel Danili, a glorious example of the central Gothic, nearly contemporary with the finest part of the ducal palace. Though less impressive in effect than the Casa Foscari or Casa Bernardo, it is of purer architecture than either, and quite unique in the delicacy of the form of the cusps in the central group of windows, which are shaped like broad scimitars, the upper foil of the windows 325 being very small. If the traveller will compare these windows with the neighbouring traceries of the ducal palace, he will easily perceive the peculiarity. Niccolo del Lido, Church of St. of no importance. Nome di Gesù, Church of no importance. Orfani, Church of no importance. Orto, Church of Star, Maria del, an interesting example of Renaissance Gothic, the traceries of the windows being very rich and quaint. It contains 4 most important tintorets: the Last Judgment, the worship of the Golden Calf, the presentation of the Virgin, and martyrdom of St. Agnes. The first 2 are among his largest and mightiest works, but grievously injured by damp and neglect, and unless the traveller is accustomed to decipher the thoughts in a picture patiently, he need not hope to derive any pleasure from them. But no pictures will better reward a resolute study. The following account of the Last Judgment, given in the 2nd volume of Modern Painters, will be useful in enabling the traveller to enter into the meaning of the picture, but its real power is only to be felt by patient examination of it. By Tintoret only has this unimaginable event, the Last Judgment, been grappled with in its verity, not typically nor symbolically, but as they may see it who shall not sleep, but be changed. Only one traditional circumstance he has received with Dante and Michelangelo, the boat of the condemned, but the impetuosity of his mind bursts out even in the adoption of this image. He has not stopped at the scowling ferryman of the one, nor at the sweeping blow and demon dragging of the other, but seized Hylas like by the limbs, and tearing up the earth in his agony, the victim is dashed into his destruction, nor is it the sluggish Lethe, nor the fiery lake that bears the cursed vessel, but the oceans of the earth and the waters of the firmament gathered into one white, ghastly cataract, the river of the wrath of God, roaring down into the gulf where the world has melted with its fervent heat, choked with the ruins of nations, and the limbs of its corpses tossed 326 out of its whirling, like water wheels. Bat-like out of the holes and caverns and shadows of the earth, the bones gather and the clay heaps heave, rattling and adhering into half-kneaded anatomies, that crawl and startle, and struggle up among the putrid weeds, with the clay clinging to their clotted hair and their heavy eyes. Sealed by the earth darkness yet, like his of old who went his way unseeing to the Siloam pool, shaking off one by one the dreams of the prison house, hardly hearing the clangor of the trumpets of the armies of God, blinded yet more as they awake by the white light of the new heaven, until the great vortex of the four winds bears up their bodies to the judgment seat. The firmament is all full of them, a very dust of human souls that drifts and floats, and falls into the interminable inevitable light. The bright clouds are darkened with them as with thick snow, currents of atom. Life in the arteries of heaven, now soaring up slowly and higher still, till the eye and the thought can follow no farther, borne up wingless by their inward faith and by the angel powers invisible, now hurled in countless drifts of horror before the breath of their condemnation. Note in the opposite picture the way the clouds are wrapped about in the distant Sinai. The figure of the little Madonna in the presentation should be compared with Titian's in his picture of the same subject in the Academy. I prefer Tintoret's infinitely, and note how much finer is the feeling with which Tintoret has relieved the glory round her head against the pure sky, than that which influenced Titian in encumbering his distance with architecture. The Martyrdom of St. Agnes was a lovely picture. It has been restored since I saw it. Ospedaleto, Church of the most monstrous example of the grotesque Renaissance which there is in Venice, the sculptures on its facade representing masses of diseased figures and swollen fruit. It is almost worth devoting an hour to the successive examination of 5 buildings, as illustrative of the last degradation of the Renaissance. San Moise is the most clumsy, Santa Maria Zobnigo the most impious, St. Eustachio the most 327 ridiculous, the Ospedaleto the most monstrous, and the head at Santa Maria Formosa the most foul. Othello, House of at the Carmini. The researches of Mr. Brown into the origin of the play of Othello have, I think, determined that Shakespeare wrote on definite historical grounds, and that Othello may be in many points identified with Christopher Moro, the lieutenant of the Republic at Cyprus, in 1508. See Raguegli Summaria Sanudo, Roman 1. His palace was standing till very lately, a Gothic building of the 14th century of which Mr. Brown possesses a drawing. It is now destroyed, and a modern square-windowed house built on its site. A statue said to be a portrait of Moro, but a most paltry work, is set in a niche in the modern wall. P. Pantilone, Church of St., said to contain a Paul Veronese, otherwise of no importance. Paternian, Church of St. Its little leaning tower forms an interesting object as the traveller sees it from the narrow canal, which passes beneath the Port San Paternian. The 2 arched lights of the belfry appear of very early workmanship, probably of the beginning of the 13th century. Pesaro Palazzo, on the Grand Canal, the most powerful and impressive in effect of all the palaces of the grotesque Renaissance. The heads upon its foundation are very characteristic of the period, but there is more genius in them than usual. Some of the mingled expressions of faces and grinning casques are very clever. Piazzetta, pillars of see final appendix under head capital. The 2 magnificent blocks of marble brought from St. Jean d'Acre, which form one of the principal ornaments of the Piazzetta, are Greek sculpture of the 6th century, and will be described in my folio work. Pieta, Church of no importance. Pietro, Church of St. at Murano. Its pictures, once valuable, are now hardly worth examination, having been spoiled by neglect. Pietro di Casello, Church of St. 361. It is said to 328 contain a Paul Veronese, and I suppose the so-called chair of St. Peter must be worth examining. Pisani Palazzo on the Grand Canal, the latest Venetian Gothic just passing into Renaissance. The capitals of the first-floor windows are, however, singularly spirited and graceful, very daringly undercut, and worth careful examination. The Paul Veronese, once the glory of this palace, is, I believe, not likely to remain in Venice. The other picture in the same room, the Death of Darius, is of no value. Pisani Palazzo at St. Stefano, late Renaissance, and of no merit, but grand in its colossal proportions, especially when seen from the narrow canal at its side, which, terminated by the apse of the Church of San Stefano, is one of the most picturesque and impressive little pieces of water scenery in Venice. Polo, Church of St. of no importance, except as an example of the advantages accruing from restoration. 1000. Lazari says of it, before this church was modernized, its principal chapel was adorned with mosaics, and possessed a parlor of silver gilt, of Byzantine workmanship, which is now lost. Polo Square of St. Campo San Polo, a large and important square, rendered interesting chiefly by 3 palaces on the side of it opposite the church, of central Gothic and fine of their time though small. One of their capitals has been given in Plate 2. Of this volume Fig. 12, they are remarkable as being decorated with sculptures of the Gothic time, in imitation of Byzantine ones, the period being marked by the dogtooth and cable being used instead of the dentil round the circles. Polo Palazzo at San G. Grisostomo, the house of Marco Polo. Roman II. Its interior court is full of interest, showing fragments of the old building in every direction, cornices, windows and doors, of almost every period, mingled among modern rebuilding and restoration of all degrees of dignity. Porta della Carta, Roman II. Priuli Palazzo, a most important and beautiful early Gothic palace at San Severo. The main entrance is from the Fundamento San Severo, but the principal facade is on the other side, towards the canal. The entrance has been grievously 329 defaced, having had winged lions filling the spandrels of its pointed arch, of which only feeble traces are now left. The facade has very early 4th-order windows in the lower story, and above, the beautiful range of 5th-order windows drawn at the bottom of Plate 18. Vol. 2, where the heads of the 4th-order range are also seen. Note their inequality, the larger one at the flank. This palace has 2 most interesting traceried angle windows also, which however I believe are later than those on the facade, and finally a rich and bold interior staircase. Procure di Nuove, see Libreria Vecchia, a graceful series buildings of late 15th century design forming the northern side of St. Mark's Place, but of no particular interest. Q. Querini Palazzo, now the Beccaria 2, Roman 3. Raphael Chiesa dell'Angelo, said to contain a Bonifacio, otherwise of no importance. Redenta, Church of the Roman II. It contains 3 interesting John Bellinis, and also in the sacristy, a most beautiful Paul Veronese. Rimer Court del House in Roman II. Rezzonico Palazzo on the Grand Canal, of the grotesque Renaissance time but less extravagant than usual. Rialto Bridge of the best building raised in the time of the grotesque Renaissance, very noble in its simplicity, in its proportions, and in its masonry. Note especially the grand way in which the oblique archstones rest on the battlements of the bridge, safe, palpably both to the sense and eye. Note also the sculpture of the Annunciation on the southern side of it. How beautifully arranged, so as to give more lightness and a grace to the arched dove, flying towards the Madonna, forming the keystone, and thus the whole action of the figures being parallel to the curve of the arch, while all the masonry is at right angles to it. Note, finally, one circumstance which gives peculiar firmness to the figure of the angel, and associates itself with the general expression of strength in 330 the whole building, namely that the sole of the advanced foot is set perfectly level, as if placed on the ground, instead of being thrown back behind like a heron's, as in most modern figures of this kind. The sculptures themselves are not good, but these pieces of feeling in them are very admirable. The 2 figures on the other side, St. Mark and St. Theodore, are inferior, though all by the same sculptor, Girolamo Campagna. The bridge was built by Antonio da Ponte in 1588. It was anciently of wood with a drawbridge in the centre, a representation of which may be seen in one of Carpaccio's pictures at the Accademia delle Belle Arti, and the traveller should observe that the interesting effect, both of this and the bridge of size, depends in great part on their both being more than bridges, the one a covered passage, the other a row of shops, sustained on an arch. No such effect can be produced merely by the masonry of the roadway itself. Rio del Palazzo, Roman II. Rocco Campiello di San, windows in Roman II. Rocco, Church of St. Notable, only for the most interesting pictures by Tintoret which it contains, namely San Rocco before the Pope. On the left of the door as we enter, a delightful picture in his best manner, but not much laboured, and like several other pictures in this church, it seems to me to have been executed at some period of the painter's life when he was either in ill health, or else had got into a mechanical way of painting, from having made too little reference to nature for a long time. There is something stiff and forced in the white draperies on both sides, and a general character about the whole which I can feel better than I can describe. but which, if I had been the painter's physician, would have immediately caused me to order him to shut up his painting room and take a voyage to the Levant and back again. The figure of the Pope is, however, extremely beautiful, and is not unworthy in its jewelled magnificence, here dark against the sky, of comparison with the figure of the high priest in the Presentation, in the Scuola di San Rocco. Annunciation. On the other side of the door on entering, a most disagreeable and dead picture, having all the 331 faults of the age, and none of the merits of the painter. It must be a matter of future investigation to me, what could cause the fall of his mind from a conception so great and so fiery as that of the Annunciation in the Scuola di San Rocco, to this miserable reprint of an idea worn out centuries before. One of the most inconceivable things in it, considered as the work of Tintoret, is that where the angel's robe drifts away behind his limb, one cannot tell by the character of the outline, or by the tones of the colour, whether the cloud comes in before the robe, or whether the robe cuts upon the cloud. The Virgin is uglier than that of the Scuola, and not half so real, and the draperies are crumpled in the most commonplace and ignoble folds. It is a picture well worth study, as an example of the extent to which the greatest mind may be betrayed by the abuse of its powers, and the neglect of its proper food in the study of nature. Pool of Bethesda. On the right side of the church in its centre, the lowest of the two pictures which occupy the wall. A noble work but eminently disagreeable, as must be all pictures of this subject, and with the same character in it of undefinable want which I have noticed in the two preceding works. The main figure in it is the cripple, who has taken up his bed, but the whole effect of this action is lost by his not turning to Christ, but flinging it on his shoulder like a triumphant porter with a huge load, and the corrupt Renaissance architecture, among which the figures are crowded, is both ugly in itself and much too small for them. It is worth noticing, for the benefit of persons who find fault with the perspective of the pre-Raphaelites, that the perspective of the brackets beneath these pillars is utterly absurd, and that, in fine, the presence or absence of perspective has nothing to do with the merits of a great picture. Not that the perspective of the pre-Raphaelites is false in any case that I have examined, the objection being just as untenable as it is ridiculous. San Rocco in the desert, above the last-named picture, a single recumbent figure in a not very interesting landscape, deserving less attention than a picture of St. Martin just opposite to it, a noble and knightly figure on horseback by Pordenone, to which I cannot pay a greater compliment than 332, by saying that I was a considerable time in doubt whether or not it was another Tintoret. San Rocco in the hospital, on the right-hand side of the altar. There are 4 vast pictures by Tintoret in the dark choir of this church, not only important by their size, each being some 25 feet long by 10 feet high, but also elaborate compositions, and remarkable, one for its extraordinary landscape, and the other as the most studied picture in which the painter has introduced horses in violent action. In order to show what waste of human mind there is in these dark churches of Venice, it is worth recording that, as I was examining these pictures, there came in a party of 18 German tourists, not hurried, nor jesting among themselves as large parties often do, but patiently submitting to their cicerone, and evidently desirous of doing their duty as intelligent travellers. They sat down for a long time on the benches of the nave, looked a little at the pool of Bethesda, walked up into the choir, and there heard a lecture of considerable length from their valet de place upon some subject connected with the altar itself, which being in German I did not understand. They then turned and went slowly out of the church, not one of the whole 18 ever giving a single glance to any of the 4 Tintorets, and only one of them, as far as I saw, even raising his eyes to the walls on which they hung, and immediately withdrawing them, with a jaded and nonchalant expression easily interpretable into nothing but old black pictures. The 2 Tintorets above noticed at the end of the church were passed also without a glance, and this neglect is not because the pictures have nothing in them capable of arresting the popular mind, but simply because they are totally in the dark, or confused among easier and more prominent objects of attention. This picture, which I have called St. Rocco in the hospital, shows him, I suppose, in his general ministrations at such places, and is one of the usual representations of a disgusting subject, from which neither Orcagna nor Tintoret seems ever to have shrunk. It is a very noble picture, carefully composed and highly wrought, but to me gives no pleasure, first on account of its subject, secondly on account of its dull brown tone all over, it being 333 impossible, or nearly so in such a scene, and at all events inconsistent with its feeling, to introduce vivid colour of any kind. So it is a brown study of diseased limbs in a close room. Cattle piece, above the picture last described. I can give no other name to this picture, whose subject I can neither guess nor discover, the picture being in the dark and the guidebooks leaving me in the same position. All I can make out of it is that there is a noble landscape with cattle and figures. It seems to me the best landscape of Tintoret's in Venice, except the flight into Egypt, and is even still more interesting from its savage character, the principal trees being pines, something like Titian's in his St. Francis receiving the stigmata and chestnuts on the slopes and in the hollows of the hills. The animals also seem first-rate, but it is too high, too much faded, and too much in the dark to be made out. It seems never to have been rich in colour, rather cool and grey, and very full of light. Finding of Body of San Rocco, on the left-hand side of the altar, an elaborate but somewhat confused picture with a flying angel in a blue drapery, but it seemed to me altogether uninteresting, or perhaps requiring more study than I was able to give it. San Rocco in Campo di Armata, so this picture is called by the sacristan. I could see no San Rocco in it, nothing but a wild group of horses and warriors in the most magnificent confusion of fall and flight ever painted by man. They seem all dashed different ways as if by a whirlwind, and a whirlwind there must be, or a thunderbolt behind them, for a huge tree is torn up and hurled into the air beyond the central figure, as if it were a shivered lance. Two of the horses meet in the midst, as if in a tournament, but in madness of fear, not in hostility. On the horse to the right is a standard-bearer, who stoops as from some foe behind him, with the lance laid across his saddlebow level, and the flag stretched out behind him as he flies, like the sail of a ship drifting from its mast. The central horseman, who meets the shock of storm or enemy whatever it be, is hurled backwards from his seat like a stone from a sling, and this figure with the shattered tree trunk behind it is the most noble part of the picture. There 334 is another grand horse on the right, however, also in full action. Two gigantic figures on foot on the left, meant to be nearer than the others, would, it seems to me, have injured the picture, had they been clearly visible, but time has reduced them to perfect subordination. Rocco, Scuola di San, bases of 1, 431, soffit ornaments of Roman 1, an interesting building of the early Renaissance, passing into Roman Renaissance. The wreaths of leafage about its shafts are wonderfully delicate and fine, though misplaced. As regards the pictures which it contains, it is one of the three most precious buildings in Italy. Buildings, I mean, consistently decorated with a series of paintings at the time of their erection, and still exhibiting that series in its original order. I suppose there can be little question, but that the three most important edifices of this kind in Italy are the Sistine Chapel, the Campo Santo of Pisa, and the Scuola di San Rocco at Venice. The first is painted by Michelangelo, the second by Orcagna, Benazzo Ghazali, Pietro Laurati, and several other men whose works are as rare as they are precious, and the third by Tintoret. Whatever the traveller may miss in Venice, he should therefore give unembarrassed attention and unbroken time to the Scuola di San Rocco, and I shall, accordingly, number the pictures and note in them, one by one, what seemed to me most worthy of observation. There are 62 in all, but 8 of these are merely of children or children's heads, and 2 of unimportant figures. The number of valuable pictures is 52, arranged on the walls and ceilings of 3 rooms, so badly lighted, in consequence of the admirable arrangements of the Renaissance architect, that it is only in the early morning that some of the pictures can be seen at all, nor can they ever be seen but imperfectly. They were all painted, however, for their places in the dark, and as compared with Tintoret's other works are therefore, for the most part, nothing more than vast sketches, made to produce, under a certain degree of shadow, the effect of finished pictures. Their treatment is thus to be considered as a kind of scene painting, differing from ordinary scene painting only in 335 this, that the effect aimed at is not that of a natural scene but a perfect picture. They differ in this respect from all other existing works, for there is not, as far as I know, any other instance in which a great master has consented to work for a room plunged into almost total obscurity. It is probable that none but Tintoret would have undertaken the task, and most fortunate that he was forced to it. For in this magnificent scene painting we have, of course, more wonderful examples, both of his handling and knowledge of effect, than could ever have been exhibited in finished pictures. While the necessity of doing much with few strokes keeps his mind so completely on the stretch throughout the work, while yet the velocity of production prevented his being wearied, that no other series of his works exhibits powers so exalted. On the other hand, owing to the velocity and coarseness of the painting, it is more liable to injury through drought or damp, and as the walls have been for years continually running down with rain, and what little sun gets into the place contrives to fall all day right on one or other of the pictures, they are nothing but wrecks of what they were, and the ruins of paintings originally coarse are not likely ever to be attractive to the public mind. 20 or 30 years ago they were taken down to be retouched, but the man to whom the task was committed providentially died, and only one of them was spoiled. I have found traces of his work upon another, but not to an extent very seriously destructive. The rest of the 62, or at any rate all that are in the upper room, appear entirely intact. Although, as compared with his other works, they are all very scenic in execution, there are great differences in their degrees of finish, and curiously enough some on the ceilings and others in the darkest places in the lower room are very nearly finished pictures, while the agony in the garden, which is in one of the best lights in the upper room, appears to have been painted in a couple of hours with a broom for a brush. For the traveller's greater convenience, I shall give a rude plan of the arrangement and list of the subjects of each group of pictures before examining them in detail. First group, on the walls of the room on the ground floor. Walls of the room. Annunciation. Adoration of Magi. Flight into Egypt. Massacre of Innocents. The Magdalens. St. Mary of Egypt. Circumcision. Assumption of Virgin. At the turn of the stairs leading to the upper room. Visitation. The Annunciation. This, which first strikes the eye, is a very just representative of the whole group, the execution being carried to the utmost limits of boldness consistent with completion. It is a well-known picture, and need not therefore be specially described, but one or two points in it require notice. The face of the Virgin is very disagreeable to the spectator from below, giving the idea of a woman about 30, who had never been handsome. If the face is untouched, it is the only instance I have ever seen of Tintoret's failing in an intended effect, for when seen near, the face is comely and youthful, and expresses only surprise, instead of the pain and fear of which it bears the aspect in the distance. I could not get near enough to see whether it had been retouched. It looks like Tintoret's work, though rather hard, but as there are unquestionable marks in the retouching of this picture, it is possible that some slight restoration of lines supposed to be faded entirely alter 337 the distant expression of the face. One of the evident pieces of repainting is the scarlet of the Madonna's lap, which is heavy and lifeless. A far more injurious one is the strip of sky seen through the doorway by which the angel enters, which has originally been of the deep golden colour of the distance on the left, and which the blundering restorer has daubed over with whitish blue, so that it looks like a bit of the wall. Luckily he has not touched the outlines of the angel's black wings, on which the whole expression of the picture depends. This angel and the group of small cherubs above form a great swinging chain, of which the dove representing the Holy Spirit forms the bend. The angels in their flight seem to be attached to this as the train of fire is to a rocket, all of them appearing to have swooped down with the swiftness of a falling star. Adoration of the Magi, the most finished picture in the scuola except the crucifixion, and perhaps the most delightful of the whole. It unites every source of pleasure that a picture can possess, the highest elevation of principal subject, mixed with the lowest detail of picturesque incident, the dignity of the highest ranks of men, opposed to the simplicity of the lowest, the quietness and serenity of an incident in cottage life, contrasted with the turbulence of troops of horsemen and the spiritual power of angels, the placing of the two doves as principal points of light in the front of the picture, in order to remind the spectator of the poverty of the mother whose child is receiving the offerings and adoration of three monarchs, is one of Tintoret's master touches. The whole scene, indeed, is conceived in his happiest manner. Nothing can be at once more humble or more dignified than the bearing of the kings, and there is a sweet reality given to the whole incident by the Madonna's stooping forward and lifting her hand in admiration of the vase of gold which has been set before the Christ. though she does so with such gentleness and quietness that her dignity is not in the least injured by the simplicity of the action. As if to illustrate the means by which the wise men were brought from the East, the whole picture is nothing but a large star, of which Christ is the center. All the figures, even the timbers of the roof, radiate from the small bright figure on which the countenances of the flying angels 338 are bent, the star itself, gleaming through the timbers. Above, being quite subordinate, the composition would almost be too artificial were it not broken by the luminous distance where the troop of horsemen are waiting for the kings. These, with a dog running at full speed, at once interrupt the symmetry of the lines, and form a point of relief from the over-concentration of all the rest of the action. Flight into Egypt. One of the principal figures here is the donkey. I have never seen any of the nobler animalcyon, or leopard, or horse, or dragon made so sublime as this quiet head of the domestic ass, chiefly owing to the grand motion in the nostril and writhing in the ears. The space of the picture is chiefly occupied by lovely landscape, and the Madonna and St. Joseph are pacing their way along a shady path upon the banks of a river at the side of the picture. I had not any conception, until I got near, how much pains had been taken with the Virgin's head. Its expression is as sweet and as intense as that of any of Raphael's, its reality far greater. The painter seems to have intended that everything should be subordinate to the beauty of this single head, and the work is a wonderful proof of the way in which a vast field of canvas may be made conducive to the interest of a single figure. This is partly accomplished by slightness of painting, so that on close examination, while there is everything to astonish in the masterly handling and purpose, there is not much perfect or very delightful painting. In fact, the two figures are treated like the living figures in a scene at the theatre and finished to perfection, while the landscape is painted as hastily as the scenes, and with the same kind of opaque size colour. It has, however, suffered as much as any of the series, and it is hardly fair to judge of its tones and colours in its present state. Massacre of the Innocents. The following account of this picture, given in Modern Painters, may be useful to the traveller, and is therefore here repeated. I have before alluded to the painfulness of Raphael's treatment of the Massacre of the Innocents. Fuseli affirms of it that in dramatic gradation he disclosed all the mother through every image of pity and terror. If this be so, I think the philosophical spirit has prevailed over the imaginative. The imagination never 339 errs, it sees all that is, and all the relations and bearings of it, but it would not have confused the mortal frenzy of maternal terror with various development of maternal character. Fear, rage, and agony at their utmost pitch sweep away all character. Humanity itself would be lost in maternity, the woman would become the mere personification of animal fury or fear. For this reason all the ordinary representations of this subject are, I think, false and cold. The artist has not heard the shrieks, nor mingled with the fugitives. He has sat down in his study to convulse features methodically and philosophize over insanity. Not so Tintoret. Knowing or feeling that the expression of the human face was, in such circumstances, not to be rendered, and that the effort could only end in an ugly falsehood, he denies himself all aid from the features. He feels that if he is to place himself or us in the midst of that maddened multitude, there can be no time allowed for watching expression. Still less does he depend on details of murder or ghastliness of death. There is no blood, no stabbing or cutting, but there is an awful substitute for these in the chiaroscuro. The scene is the outer vestibule of a palace. The slippery marble floor is fearfully barred across by sanguine shadows, so that our eyes seem to become bloodshot and strained with strange horror and deadly vision. A lake of life before them, like the burning scene of the doomed Moabite on the water that came by the way of Edom. A huge flight of stairs without parapet descends. On the left, down this rush a crowd of women mixed with the murderers. The child in the arms of one has been seized by the limbs. She hurls herself over the edge and falls head downmost. Dragging the child out of the grasp by her weight, she will be dashed dead in a second. Close to us is the great struggle. A heap of the mothers, entangled in one mortal writhe with each other, and the swords, one of the murderers dashed down and crushed beneath them, the sword of another caught by the blade and dragged at by a woman's naked hand. The youngest and fairest of the women, her child just torn away from a death grasp, and clasped to her breast with the grip of a steel vice, falls backwards, helpless over the heap, right on the sword points, all knit together and hurled down in one hopeless, frenzied, furious abandonment 340 of body and soul in the effort to save. Far back at the bottom of the stairs, there is something in the shadow like a heap of clothes. It is a woman sitting quiet, quite quiet, still as any stone. She looks down steadfastly on her dead child, laid along on the floor before her, and her hand is pressed softly upon her brow. I have nothing to add to the above description of this picture, except that I believe there may have been some change in the colour of the shadow that crosses the pavement. The chequers of the pavements are, in the light, golden white and pale grey, in the shadow, red and dark grey, the white in the sunshine becoming red in the shadow. I formerly supposed that this was meant to give greater horror to the scene, and it is very like Tintoret if it be so, but there is a strangeness and discordance in it which makes me suspect the colours may have changed. The Magdalen, this and the picture opposite to it, St. Mary of Egypt, have been painted to fill up narrow spaces between the windows which were not large enough to receive compositions, and yet in which single figures would have looked awkwardly thrust into the corner. Tintoret has made these spaces as large as possible by filling them with landscapes, which are rendered interesting by the introduction of single figures of very small size. He has not, however, considered his task of making a small piece of wainscot look like a large one, worth the stretch of his powers, and has painted these two landscapes just as carelessly and as fast as an upholsterer's journeyman finishing a room at a railroad hotel. The colour is for the most part opaque, and dashed or scrawled on in the manner of a scene painter, and as during the whole morning the sun shines upon the one picture, and during the afternoon upon the other, hues, which were originally thin and imperfect, are now dried in many places into mere dirt upon the canvas. With all these drawbacks the pictures are of very high interest, for although, as I said, hastily and carelessly, they are not languidly painted, on the contrary he has been in his hottest and grandest temper, and in this first one Magdalen the laurel tree, with its leaves driven hither and thither among flakes. A fiery cloud has been probably 340, one of the greatest achievements that his hand performed in landscape. Its roots are entangled in underwood, of which every leaf seems to be articulated, yet all is as wild as if it had grown there instead of having been painted. There has been a mountain distance, too, and a sky of stormy light, of which I infinitely regret the loss, for though its masses of light are still discernible, its variety of hue is all sunk into a withered brown. There is a curious piece of execution in the striking of the light upon a brook, which runs under the roots of the laurel in the foreground. These roots are traced in shadow against the bright surface of the water. Another painter would have drawn the light first, and drawn the dark roots over it. Tintoret has laid in a brown ground which he has left for the roots, and painted the water through their interstices with a few mighty rolls of his brush laden with white. St. Mary of Egypt. This picture differs but little in the plan from the one opposite, except that St. Mary has her back towards us, and the Magdalen her face, and that the tree on the other side of the brook is a palm instead of a laurel. The brook Jordan is, however, here much more important, and the water painting is exceedingly fine. Of all painters that I know in old times, Tintoret is the fondest of running water. There was a sort of sympathy between it and his own impetuous spirit. The rest of the landscape is not of much interest, except so far as it is pleasant to see trunks of trees drawn by single strokes of the brush. The Circumcision of Christ. The custard has some story about this picture having been painted in imitation of Paul Veronese. I much doubt if Tintoret ever imitated anybody, but this picture is the expression of his perception of what Veronese delighted in, the nobility that there may be in mere golden tissue and coloured drapery. It is, in fact, a picture of the moral power of gold and colour, and the chief use of the attendant priest is to support upon his shoulders the crimson robe, with its square tablets of black and gold, and yet nothing is withdrawn from the interest or dignity of the scene. Tintoret has taken immense pains with the head of the high priest. I know not any existing old man's head so exquisitely tender or so noble in its lines. He receives the infant Christ 342 in his arms kneeling, and looking down upon the child with infinite veneration and love, and the flashing of golden rays from its head is made the centre of light and all interest. The whole picture is like a golden charger to receive the child. The priest's dress is held up behind him that it may occupy larger space. The tables and floor are covered with checkerwork. The shadows of the temple are filled with brazen lamps, and above all are hung masses of curtains whose crimson folds are strewn over with golden flakes. Next to the Adoration of the Magi, this picture is the most laboriously finished of the Scuola di San Rocco, and it is unquestionably the highest existing type of the sublimity, which may be thrown into the treatment of accessories of dress and decoration. Assumption of the Virgin. On the tablet or panel of stone which forms the side of the tomb out of which the Madonna rises, is this inscription in large letters: Rest, Antonius Florian, 1834. Exactly in proportion to a man's idiocy is always the size of the letters in which he writes his name on the picture that he spoils. The old mosaicists in St. Mark's have not, in a single instance, as far as I know, signed their names, but the spectator who wishes to know who destroyed the effect of the nave may see his name inscribed, twice over, in letters half a foot high, Bartolomeo Bazza. I have never seen Tintoret's name signed, except in the Great Crucifixion, but this Antony Florian, I have no doubt, repainted the whole side of the tomb that he might put his name on it. The picture is, of course, ruined wherever he touched it, that is to say, half over. The circle of cherubs in the sky is still pure, and the design of the great painter is palpable enough yet in the grand flight of the horizontal angel, on whom the Madonna half leans as she ascends. It has been a noble picture, and is a grievous loss, but happily there are so many pure ones that we need not spend time in gleaning treasures out of the ruins of this. Visitation. A small picture painted in his very best manner, exquisite in its simplicity, unrivaled in vigor, well preserved, and as a piece of painting, certainly one of the most precious in Venice. Of course it does not show any of his high inventive powers, nor can a picture of 4 middle-sized 343 figures be made a proper subject of comparison with large canvases containing 40 or 50. But it is, for this very reason, painted with such perfect ease, and yet with no slackness either of affection or power, that there is no picture that I covet so much. It is, besides, altogether free from the Renaissance taint of dramatic effect. The gestures are as simple and natural as Giotto's, only expressed by grander lines, such as none but Tintoret ever reached. The draperies are dark, relieved against a light sky, the horizon being excessively low, and the outlines of the drapery so severe, that the intervals between the figures look like ravines between great rocks, and have all the sublimity of an alpine valley at twilight. This precious picture is hung about 30 feet above the eye, but by looking at it in a strong light, it is discoverable that the Saint Elizabeth is dressed in green and crimson, the Virgin in the peculiar red which all great colorists delight in, a sort of glowing brick color or brownish scarlet, opposed to rich golden brownish black, and both have white kerchiefs or drapery thrown over their shoulders. Zacharias leans on his staff behind them in a black dress with white sleeves. The stroke of brilliant white light, which outlines the knee of St. Elizabeth, is a curious instance of the habit of the painter to relieve his dark forms by a sort of halo of more vivid light, which until lately one would have been apt to suppose a somewhat artificial and unjustifiable means of effect. The daguerreotype has shown, what the naked eye never could, that the instinct of the great painter was true, and that there is actually such a sudden and sharp line of light round the edges of dark objects relieved by luminous space. Opposite this picture is a most precious Titian, the Annunciation, full of grace and beauty. I think the Madonna one of the sweetest figures he ever painted. But if the traveller has entered at all into the spirit of Tintoret, he will immediately feel the comparative feebleness and conventionality of the Titian. Note especially the mean and petty folds of the angel's drapery, and compare them with the draperies of the opposite picture. The larger pictures at the sides of the stairs by Zanchi and Negri are utterly worthless. Second group, on the walls of the upper room. The walls of the upper room. Adoration of shepherds. Baptism. Resurrection. Agony in gardens. Last Supper. Altar piece, St. Rocco. Miracle of loaves. Resurrection of Lazarus. Ascension. Pool of Bethesda. Temptation. St. Rocco. St. Sebastian. The Adoration of the Shepherds. This picture commences the series of the upper room, which, as already noticed, is painted with far less care than that of the lower. It is one of the painter's inconceivable caprices that the only canvases that are in good light should be covered in this hasty manner, while those in the dungeon below, and on the ceiling above, are all highly laboured. It is, however, just possible that the covering of these walls may have been an afterthought, when he had got tired of his work. They are also, for the most part, illustrative of a principle of which I am more and more convinced every day, that historical and figure pieces ought not to be made vehicles for effects of light. The light which is fit for a historical picture is that tempered semi-sunshine of which, in general, the works of Titian are the best examples, and of which the picture we have just passed, the Visitation, is a perfect example from the hand of one greater than Titian. So also the three crucifixions of San Rocco, San Cassano, and St. John and Paul, the adoration of the 345 Magi here, and in general the finest works of the master. But Tintoret was not a man to work in any formal or systematic manner, and exactly like Turner, we find him recording every effect which nature herself displays. Still he seems to regard the pictures which deviate from the great general principle of colorists rather as tours de force than as sources of pleasure, and I do not think there is any instance of his having worked out one of these tricky pictures with thorough affection, except only in the case of the Marriage of Cana. By tricky pictures, I mean those which display light entering in different directions, and attract the eye to the effects rather than to the figure which displays them. Of this treatment, we have already had a marvellous instance in the candlelight picture of the Last Supper in San Giorgio Maggiore. This adoration of the shepherds has probably been nearly as wonderful when first painted. The Madonna is seated on a kind of hammock floor made of rope netting, covered with straw. It divides the picture into 2 stories, of which the uppermost contains the Virgin, with 2 women who are adoring Christ, and shows light entering from above through the loose timbers of the roof of the stable, as well as through the bars of a square window. The lower division shows this light falling behind the netting upon the stable floor, occupied by a cock and a cow, and against this light are relieved the figures of the shepherds, for the most part in dematint, but with flakes of more vigorous sunshine falling here and there upon them from above. The optical illusion has originally been as perfect as one of Hunt's best interiors, but it is most curious that no part of the work seems to have been taken any pleasure in by the painter. It is all by his hand, but it looks as if he had been bent only on getting over the ground. It is literally a piece of scene painting, and is exactly what we might fancy Tintoret to have done, had he been forced to paint scenes at a small theatre at £1 a day. I cannot think that the whole canvas, though 14 feet high and 10 wide or thereabouts, could have taken him more than a couple of days to finish, and it is very noticeable that exactly in proportion to the brilliant effects of light is the coarseness of the execution, for the figures of the Madonna and of the women above, which are not in any strong effect, are painted with some care, while the shepherds and the cow are alike slovenly, and the latter, which is in full sunshine, is recognizable for a cow more by its size and that of its horns than by any care given to its form. It is interesting to contrast this slovenly and mean sketch with the ass head in the flight into Egypt, on which the painter exerted his full power. As an effect of light, however, the work is, of course, most interesting. One point in the treatment is especially noticeable. There is a peacock in the rack beyond the cow, and under other circumstances, one cannot doubt that Tintoret would have liked a peacock in full colour, and would have painted it green and blue with great satisfaction. It is sacrificed to the light, however, and is painted in warm grey, with a dim eye or 2 in the tail. This process is exactly analogous to Turner's taking the colours out of the flags of his ships in the Gosport. Another striking point is the litter with which the whole picture is filled in order more to confuse the eye. There is straw sticking from the roof, straw all over the hammock floor, and straw struggling hither and thither all over the floor itself, and to add to the confusion, the glory around. The head of the infant, instead of being united and serene, is broken into little bits, and is like a glory of chopped straw. But the most curious thing, after all, is the want of delight in any of the principal figures, and the comparative meanness and commonplaceness of even the folds of the drapery. It seems as if Tintoret had determined to make the shepherds as uninteresting as possible, but one does not see why their very clothes should be ill painted, and their disposition unpicturesque. I believe, however, though it never struck me until I had examined this picture, that this is one of the painter's fixed principles. He does not, with German sentimentality, make shepherds and peasants graceful or sublime, but he purposely vulgarizes them, not by making their actions or their faces boorish or disagreeable, but rather by painting them ill and composing their draperies tamely. As far as I recollect at present, the principle is universal with him. Exactly in proportion to the dignity of character is the beauty of the painting. He will not put out his strength upon any man belonging to the lower classes, and in order to know what the 347 painter is, one must see him at work on a king, a senator, or a saint. The curious connection of this with the aristocratic tendencies of the Venetian nation, when we remember that Tintoret was the greatest man whom that nation produced, may become very interesting if followed out. I forgot to note that, though the peacock is painted with great regardlessness of colour, there is a feature in it which no common painter would have observed, the peculiar flatness of the back, and undulation of the shoulders. The bird's body is all there, though its feathers are a good deal neglected. And the same thing is noticeable in a cock who is pecking among the straw near the spectator, though in other respects a shabby cock enough. The fact is, I believe, he had made his shepherds so commonplace that he dare not paint his animals well, otherwise one would have looked at nothing in the picture but the peacock, cock and cow. I cannot tell what the shepherds are offering. They look like milk bowls, but they are awkwardly held up, with such twistings of body as would have certainly spilt the milk. A woman in front has a basket of eggs, but this I imagine to be merely to keep up the rustic character of the scene, and not part of the shepherd's offerings. Baptism, there is more of the true picture quality in this work than in the former one, but still very little appearance of enjoyment or care. The colour is for the most part grey and uninteresting, and the figures are thin and meagre in form, and slightly painted, so much so that of the 19 figures in the distance, about a dozen are hardly worth calling figures, and the rest are so sketched and flourished in that one can hardly tell which is which. There is one point about it very interesting to a landscape painter. The river is seen far into the distance, with a piece of copse bordering it. The sky beyond is dark, but the water nevertheless receives a brilliant reflection from some unseen rent in the clouds, so brilliant that when I was first at Venice, not being accustomed to Tintoret's slight execution, or to see pictures so much injured, I took this piece of water for a piece of sky. The effect, as Tintoret has arranged it, is indeed somewhat unnatural, but it is valuable as showing his recognition of a principle, unknown to half the historical painters of the present 348 day, that the reflection seen in the water is totally different from the object seen above it, and that it is very possible to have a bright light in reflection where there appears nothing but darkness to be reflected. The clouds in the sky itself are round, heavy and lightless, and in a great degree spoil what would otherwise be a fine landscape distance. Behind the rocks on the right, a single head is seen, with a collar on the shoulders. It seems to be intended for a portrait of some person connected with the picture. Resurrection, another of the effect of light pictures, and not a very striking one, the best part of it being the two distant figures of the Marys seen in the dawn of the morning. The conception of the resurrection itself is characteristic of the worst points of Tintoret. His impetuosity is here in the wrong place. Christ bursts out of the rock like a thunderbolt, and the angels themselves seem likely to be crushed under the rent stones of the tomb. Had the figure of Christ been sublime, this conception might have been accepted, but on the contrary it is weak, mean and painful, and the whole picture is languidly or roughly painted, except only the fig tree at the top of the rock, which by a curious caprice is not only drawn in the painter's best manner, but has golden ribs to all its leaves, making it look like one of the beautiful crossed or checkered patterns, of which he is so fond in his dresses, the leaves themselves being a dark olive brown. The agony in the garden. I cannot at present understand the order of these subjects, but they may have been misplaced. This of all the San Rocco pictures is the most hastily painted, but it is not, like those we have been passing, clodly painted. It seems to have been executed altogether with a hearth-broom, and in a few hours. It is another of the effects, and a very curious one. The angel who bears the cup to Christ is surrounded by a red halo, yet the light which falls upon the shoulders of the sleeping disciples, and upon the leaves of the olivet trees is cool and silvery, while the troop coming up to seize Christ are seen by torchlight. Judas, who is the second figure, points to Christ, but turns his head away as he does so, as unable to look at him. This is a noble touch. The foliage is also exceedingly fine, though what kind of olivet tree 349 bears such leaves I know not, each of them being about the size of a man's hand. If there be any which bear such foliage, their olives must be the size of coconuts. This, however, is true only of the underwood, which is perhaps not meant for olive. There are some taller trees at the top of the picture, whose leaves are of a more natural size. On closely examining the figures of the troops on the left, I find that the distant ones are concealed, all but the limbs, by a sort of arch of dark colour, which is now so injured that I cannot tell whether it was foliage or ground. I suppose it to have been a mass of close foliage, through which the troop is breaking its way. Judas rather showing them the path than actually pointing to Christ, as it is written, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place. St. Peter, as the most zealous of the three disciples, the only one who was to endeavor to defend his master, is represented as awakening and turning his head toward the troop, while James and John are buried in profound slumber, laid in magnificent languor among the leaves. The picture is singularly impressive, when seen far enough off, as an image of thick forest gloom amidst the rich and tender foliage of the south, the leaves, however, tossing as in disturbed night air, and the flickering of the torches and of the branches, contrasted with the steady flame which from the angel's presence is spread over the robes of the disciples. The strangest feature in the whole is that the Christ also is represented as sleeping. The angel seems to appear to him in a dream. The Last Supper, a most unsatisfactory picture. I think about the worst I know of Tintorets, where there is no appearance of retouching. He always makes the disciples in this scene too vulgar. They are here not only vulgar but diminutive, and Christ is at the end of the table, the smallest figure of them all. The principal figures are two mendicants sitting on steps in front, a kind of supporters, but I suppose intended to be waiting for the fragments. A dog, in still more earnest expectation, is watching the movements of the disciples, who are talking together, Judas having just gone out. Christ is represented as giving what one at first supposes is the sop to Judas, but as the disciple who received it has a glory 350, and there are only 11 at table, it is evidently the sacramental bread. The room in which they are assembled is a sort of large kitchen, and the host is seen employed at a dresser in the background. This picture has not only been originally poor, but is one of those exposed all day to the sun, and is dried into mere dusty canvas. Where there was once blue, there is now nothing. Saint Rocco in glory. One of the worst order of Tintorets, with apparent smoothness and finish, yet languidly painted, as if in illness or fatigue. Very dark and heavy in tone also, its figures for the most part of an awkward middle size, about 5 feet high, and very uninteresting. St. Rocco ascends to heaven, looking down upon a crowd of poor and sick persons who are blessing and adoring him. One of these, kneeling at the bottom, is very nearly a repetition, though a careless and indolent one, of that of St. Stephen in St. Giorgio Maggiore, and of the central figure in the paradise of the ducal palace. It is a kind of lay figure, of which he seems to have been fond. Its clasped hands are here shockingly painted, I should think unfinished. It forms the only important light at the bottom, relieved on a dark ground. At the top of the picture, the figure of St. Rocco is seen in shadow against the light of the sky, and all the rest is in confused shadow. The commonplaceness of this composition is curiously connected with the languor of thought and touch throughout the work. Miracle of the Loaves. Hardly anything but a fine piece of landscape is here left. It is more exposed to the sun than any other picture in the room, and its draperies, having been in great part painted in blue, are now mere patches of the colour of starch. The scene is also very imperfectly conceived. The 21 figures, including Christ and his disciples, very ill represent a crowd of 7,000. Still less is the marvel of the miracle expressed by perfect ease and rest of the reclining figures in the foreground, who do not so much as look surprised. Considered merely as reclining figures, and as pieces of effect in half light, they have once been fine. The landscape, which represents the slope of a woody hill, has a very grand and faraway look. Behind it is a 351 great space of streaky sky, almost prismatic in colour, rosy and golden clouds covering up its blue, and some fine vigorous trees thrown against it, painted in about 10 minutes each, however, by curly touches of the brush, and looking rather more like seaweed than foliage. Resurrection of Lazarus, very strangely and not impressively conceived. Christ is half reclining, half sitting at the bottom of the picture, while Lazarus is disencumbered of his grave clothes at the top of it, the scene being the side of a rocky hill, and the mouth of the tomb probably once visible in the shadow on the left. But all that is now discernible is a man having his limbs unbound, as if Christ were merely ordering a prisoner to be loosed. There appears neither awe nor agitation, nor even much astonishment in any of the figures of the group. But the picture is more vigorous than any of the three last mentioned, and the upper part of it is quite worthy of the master, especially its noble fig tree and laurel, which he has painted, in one of his usual fits of caprice, as carefully as that in the resurrection of Christ, opposite. Perhaps he has some meaning in this. He may have been thinking of the verse, "Behold the fig tree and all the trees," when they now shoot forth 100. In the present instance, the leaves are dark only, and have no golden veins. The uppermost figures also come dark against the sky, and would form a precipitous mass like a piece of the rock itself, but that they are broken in upon by one of the limbs of Lazarus, bandaged and in full light, which to my feeling sadly injures the picture, both as a disagreeable object and a light in the wrong place. The grass and weeds are throughout carefully painted, but the lower figures are of little interest, and the face of the Christ a grievous failure. The Ascension. I have always admired this picture, though it is very slight and thin in execution, and cold in colour, but it is remarkable for its thorough effect of open air, and for the sense of motion and clashing in the wings of the angels which sustain the Christ. They owe this effect a good deal to the manner in which they are set, edge on. All seem like sword blades cutting the air. It is the most curious in conception of all the pictures in the scuola, for it represents 352 beneath the Ascension, a kind of epitome of what took place before the Ascension. In the distance are two apostles walking, meant, I suppose, for the two going to Emmaus. Nearer are a group round a table, to remind us of Christ appearing to them as they sat at meat, and in the foreground is a single reclining figure of, I suppose, St. Peter, because we are told that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12, but this interpretation is doubtful, for why should not the vision by the lake of Tiberias be expressed also? And the strange thing of all is the scene, for Christ ascended from the Mount of Olives, but the disciples are walking, and the table is set in a little marshy and grassy valley, like some of the bits near Maisonneuve on the Jura, with a brook running through it, so capitally expressed, that I believe it is this which makes me so fond of the picture. The reflections are as scientific in the diminution, in the image, of large masses of bank above, as any of Turner's, and the marshy and reedy ground looks as if one would sink into it. But what all this has to do with the Ascension I cannot see. The figure of Christ is not undignified, but by no means either interesting or sublime. Pool of Bethesda. I have no doubt the principal figures have been repainted, but as the colours are faded and the subject disgusting, I have not paid this picture sufficient attention to say how far the injury extends, nor need anyone spend time upon it, unless after having first examined all the other tintorets in Venice. All the great Italian painters appear insensible to the feeling of disgust at disease, but this study of the population of an hospital is without any points of contrast, and I wish Tintoret had not condescended to paint it. This and the 6 preceding paintings have all been uninteresting, I believe chiefly owing to the observance in them of Sir Joshua's rule for the heroic, that drapery is to be mere drapery, and not silk, nor satin, nor brocade. However wise such a rule may be when applied to works of the purest religious art, it is anything but wise as respects works of colour. Tintoret is never quite himself unless he has fur or velvet, or rich stuff of one sort or the other, or jewels or armour, or something that he can put play of colour into among his figures, and not dead folds of linsey-woolsey. And I believe that even the best pictures of 353 Raphael and Angelico are not a little helped by their hems of robes, jewelled crowns, priests' copes, and so on. And the pictures that have nothing of this kind in them, as for instance the Transfiguration, are to my mind not a little dull. Temptation. This picture singularly illustrates what has just been observed. It owes great part of its effect to the lustre of the jewels in the armlet of the evil angel, and to the beautiful colours of his wings. These are slight accessories apparently, but they enhance the value of all the rest, and they have evidently been enjoyed by the painter. The armlet is seen by reflected light, its stones shining by inward lustre, this occult fire being the only hint given of the real character of the tempter, who is otherwise represented in the form of a beautiful angel, though the face is sensual. We can hardly tell how far it was intended to be therefore expressive of evil, for Tintoret's good angels have not always the purest features, but there is a peculiar subtlety in this telling of the story by so slight a circumstance as the glare of the jewels in the darkness. It is curious to compare this imagination with that of the mosaics in St. Mark's, in which Satan is a black monster, with horns and head and tail complete. The whole of the picture is powerfully and carefully painted, though very broadly. It is a strong effect of light, and therefore, as usual, subdued in colour. The painting of the stones in the foreground I have always thought, and still think, the best piece of rock drawing before Turner, and the most amazing instance of Tintoret's perceptiveness afforded by any of his pictures. St. Rocco, 3 figures occupy the spandrels of the window above this and the following picture, painted merely in light and shade, 2 larger than life, 1 rather smaller. I believe these to be by Tintoret, but as they are quite in the dark so that the execution cannot be seen, and very good designs of the kind have been furnished by other masters, I cannot answer for them. The figure of St. Rocco, as well as its companion St. Sebastian, is coloured. They occupy the narrow intervals between the windows, and are of course invisible under ordinary circumstances. By a great deal of straining of the eyes, and sheltering them with the hand from the light, some 354 little idea of the design may be obtained. The St. Rocco is a fine figure, though rather coarse, but at all events worth as much light as would enable us to see it. St. Sebastian, this, the companion figure, is one of the finest things in the whole room, and assuredly the most majestic Saint Sebastian in existence, as far as mere humanity can be majestic, for there is no effort at any expression of angelic or saintly resignation. The effort is simply to realize the fact of the martyrdom, and it seems to me that this is done to an extent not even attempted by any other painter. I never saw a man die a violent death, and therefore cannot say whether this figure be true or not, but it gives the grandest and most intense impression of truth. The figure is dead, and well it may be, for there is 1 arrow through the forehead and another through the heart, but the eyes are open though glazed, and the body is rigid in the position in which it last stood, the left arm raised and the left limb advanced, something in the attitude of a soldier sustaining an attack under his shield, while the dead eyes are still turned in the direction from which the arrows came. But the most characteristic feature is the way these arrows are fixed. In the common martyrdoms of St. Sebastian they are stuck into him here and there like pins, as if they had been shot from a great distance and had come faltering down, entering the flesh but a little way, and rather bleeding the saint to death than mortally wounding him. But Tintoret had no such ideas about archery. He must have seen bows drawn in battle, like that of Jehu when he smote Jehoram between the harness. All the arrows in the saint's body lie straight in the same direction, broad-feathered and strong-shafted, and sent apparently with the force of thunderbolts. Every one of them has gone through him like a lance, 2 through the limbs, 1 through the arm, 1 through the heart, and the last has crashed through the forehead, nailing the head to the tree behind as if it had been dashed in by a sledgehammer. The face, in spite of its ghastliness, is beautiful, and has been serene, and the light which enters first and glistens on the plumes of the arrows, dies softly away upon the curling hair, and mixes with the glory upon the forehead. There is not a more remarkable picture in Venice, and yet I do not suppose that 1 in 1,000 of the 355 travellers who pass through the Scuola so much as perceives there is a picture in the place which it occupies. Third group, on the roof of the upper room. On the roof of the upper room. Moses striking the rock. Plague of serpents. Fall of manna. Jacob's dream. Ezekiel's vision. Fall of man. Elijah. Jonah. Joshua. Sacrifice of Isaac. Elijah at the brook. Paschal feast. Elisha feeding the people. Moses striking the rock. We now come to the series of pictures upon which the painter concentrated the strength he had reserved for the upper room, and in some sort wisely, for though it is not pleasant to examine pictures on a ceiling, they are at least distinctly visible without straining the eyes against the light. They are carefully conceived and thoroughly well painted in proportion to their distance from the eye. This carefulness of thought is apparent at a glance. The Moses striking the rock embraces the whole of the 17th chapter of Exodus, and even something more, for it is not from that chapter, but from parallel passages that we gather the facts of the impatience of Moses and the wrath of God at the waters of Meribah, both which facts are shown by the leaping of the stream out of the rock 6 ways at once, forming a great arch over the head of Moses, and by the partial veiling of the countenance of the Supreme Being. This latter is the most painful part of the whole picture, at least as it is seen from below, and I believe that in some repairs of the roof, this head 356 must have been destroyed and repainted. It is one of Tintoret's usual fine thoughts that the lower part of the figure is veiled, not merely by clouds, but in a kind of watery sphere, showing the deity coming to the Israelites at that particular moment as the Lord of the rivers and of the fountain of the waters. The whole figure, as well as that of Moses and the greater number of those in the foreground, is at once dark and warm, black and red being the prevailing colors, while the distance is bright gold touched with blue, and seems to open into the picture like a break of blue sky after rain. How exquisite is this expression, by mere color, of the main force of the fact represented, that is to say, joy and refreshment after sorrow and scorching heat. But when we examine of what this distance consists, we shall find still more cause for admiration. The blue in it is not the blue of sky, it is obtained by blue stripes upon white tents glowing in the sunshine, and in front of these tents is seen that great battle with Amalek of which the account is given in the remainder of the chapter, and for which the Israelites received strength in the streams which ran out of the rock in Horeb. Considered merely as a picture, the opposition of cool light to warm shadow is one of the most remarkable pieces of color in the scuola, and the great mass of foliage which waves over the rocks on the left appears to have been elaborated with his highest power and his most sublime invention. But this noble passage is much injured, and now hardly visible. Plague of serpents. The figures in the distance are remarkably important in this picture, Moses himself being among them. In fact, the whole scene is filled chiefly with middle-sized figures, in order to increase the impression of space. It is interesting to observe the difference in the treatment of this subject by the three great painters, Michelangelo, Rubens, and Tintoret. The first two, equal to the latter in energy, had less love of liberty. They were fond of binding their compositions into knots, Tintoret of scattering his far and wide. They all alike preserved the unity of composition, but the unity in the first two is obtained by binding, and that of the last by springing from one source, and together with this feeling comes his love of space, which 357 makes him less regard the rounding and form of objects themselves than their relations of light and shade and distance. Therefore Rubens and Michelangelo made the fiery serpents huge boa constrictors, and knotted the sufferers together with them. Tintoret does not like to be so bound, so he makes the serpents little flying and fluttering monsters like lampreys with wings, and the children of Israel, instead of being thrown into convulsed and writhing groups, are scattered, fainting in the fields, far away in the distance. As usual, Tintoret's conception, while thoroughly characteristic of himself, is also truer to the words of Scripture. We are told that the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people. We are not told that they crushed the people to death, and while thus the truest, it is also the most terrific conception. 1000. Angelo's would be terrific if one could believe in it, but our instinct tells us that boa constrictors do not come in armies, and we look upon the picture with as little emotion as upon the handle of a vase, or any other form worked out of serpents, where there is no probability of serpents actually occurring. But there is a probability in Tintoret's conception. We feel that it is not impossible that there should come up a swarm of these small winged reptiles, and their horror is not diminished by their smallness, not that they have any of the grotesque terribleness of German invention. They might have been made infinitely uglier with small panes, but it is their veritableness which makes them awful. They have triangular heads with sharp beaks or muzzle, and short, rather thick bodies with bony processes down the back like those of sturgeons, and small wings spotted with orange and black, and round, glaring eyes, not very large but very ghastly, with an intense delight in biting expressed in them. It is observable that the Venetian painter has got his main idea of them from the seahorses and small reptiles of the lagoons. These monsters are fluttering and writhing about everywhere, fixing on whatever they come near with their sharp venomous heads, and they are coiling about on the ground, and all the shadows and thickets are full of them, so that there is no escape anywhere. And in order to give the idea of greater extent to the plague, 358 Tintoret has not been content with one horizon. I have before mentioned the excessive strangeness of this composition, in having a cavern open in the right of the foreground, through which is seen another sky and another horizon. At the top of the picture, the divine being is seen borne by angels, apparently passing over the congregation in wrath, involved in masses of dark clouds, while behind an angel of mercy is descending toward Moses, surrounded by a globe of white light. This globe is hardly seen from below. It is not a common glory but a transparent sphere like a bubble, which not only envelopes the angel, but crosses the figure of Moses, throwing the upper part of it into a subdued pale color, as if it were crossed by a sunbeam. Tintoret is the only painter who plays these tricks with transparent light, the only man who seems to have perceived the effects of sunbeams, mists, and clouds in the far-away atmosphere, and to have used what he saw on towers, clouds, or mountains to enhance the sublimity of his figures. The whole upper part of this picture is magnificent, less with respect to individual figures than for the drift of its clouds and originality and complication of its light and shade. It is something like Raphael's vision of Ezekiel, but far finer. It is difficult to understand how any painter, who could represent floating clouds so nobly as he has done here, could ever paint the odd, round, pillowy masses which so often occur in his more carelessly designed sacred subjects. The lower figures are not so interesting, and the whole is painted with a view to effect from below, and gains little by close examination. Fall of manner. In none of these three large compositions has the painter made the slightest effort at expression in the human countenance. Everything is done by gesture, and the faces of the people who are drinking from the rock, dying from the serpent bites, and eating the manna, are all alike as calm as if nothing was happening. In addition to this, as they are painted for distant effect, the heads are unsatisfactory and coarse when seen near, and perhaps in this last picture the more so, and yet the story is exquisitely told. We have seen in the church of San Giorgio Maggiore another example of his treatment of it, where, however, the gathering of 359 manna is a subordinate employment, but here it is principal. Now observe, we are told of the manna that it was found in the morning, that then there lay round about the camp a small round thing like the hoarfrost, and that when the sun waxed hot it melted. Tintoret has endeavoured, therefore, first of all, to give the idea of coolness. The congregation are reposing in a soft green meadow, surrounded by blue hills, and there are rich trees above them, to the branches of one of which is attached a great grey drapery to catch the manna as it comes down. In any other picture such a mass of drapery would assuredly have had some vivid colour, but here it is grey. The fields are cool frosty green, the mountains cold blue, and to complete the expression and meaning of all this, there is a most important point to be noted in the form of the deity, seen above through an opening in the clouds. There are at least 10 or 12 other pictures in which the form of the Supreme Being occurs, to be found in the Scuola di San Rocco alone, and in every one of these instances it is richly coloured, the garments being generally red and blue, but in this picture of the manna the figure is snow white. Thus the painter endeavours to show the deity as the giver of bread, just as in the striking of the rock we saw that he represented him as the lord of the rivers, the fountains, and the waters. There is one other very sweet incident at the bottom of the picture. 4 or 5 sheep, instead of pasturing, turn their heads aside to catch the manna as it comes down, or seem to be licking it off each other's fleeces. The tree above, to which the drapery is tied, is the most delicate and delightful piece of leafage in all the Scuola. It has a large sharp leaf, something like that of a willow, but 5 times the size. Jacob's Dream, a picture which has good effect from below but gains little when seen near. It is an embarrassing one for any painter, because angels always look awkward going up and down stairs. One does not see the use of their wings. Tintoret has thrown them into buoyant and various attitudes, but has evidently not treated the subject with delight, and it is seen to all the more disadvantage because just above the painting of the Ascension, in which the full fresh power 360 of the painter is developed. One would think this latter picture had been done just after a walk among hills, for it is full of the most delicate effects of transparent cloud, more or less veiling the faces and forms of the angels, and covering with white light the silvery sprays of the palms, while the clouds in the Jacob's Dream are the ordinary rotundities of the studio. Ezekiel's Vision. I suspect this has been repainted, it is so heavy and dead in colour, a fault, however, observable in many of the small pictures on the ceiling, and perhaps the natural result of the fatigue of such a mind as Tintoret's. A painter who threw such intense energy into some of his works can hardly but have been languid in others in a degree never experienced by the more tranquil minds of less powerful workmen, and when this languor overtook him whilst he was at work on pictures where a certain space had to be covered by mere force of arm, this heaviness of colour could hardly but have been the consequence. It shows itself chiefly in reds and other hot hues, many of the pictures in the ducal palace also displaying it in a painful degree. This Ezekiel's Vision is, however, in some measure worthy of the master, in the wild and horrible energy with which the skeletons are leaping up about the prophet, but it might have been less horrible and more sublime, no attempt being made to represent the space of the Valley of Dry Bones, and the whole canvas being occupied only by 8 figures, of which 5 are half skeletons. It is strange that, in such a subject, the prevailing hues should be red and brown. Fall of Man. The two canvases last named are the most considerable in size upon the roof, after the centre pieces. We now come to the smaller subjects which surround the striking the rock. Of these this Fall of Man is the best, and I should think it very fine anywhere but in the Scuola di San Rocco. There is a grand light on the body of Eve, and the vegetation is remarkably rich, but the faces are coarse, and the composition uninteresting. I could not get near enough to see what the grey object is upon which Eve appears to be sitting, nor could I see any serpent. It is made prominent in the picture of the Academy of this same 361 subject, so that I suppose it is hidden in the darkness, together with much detail which it would be necessary to discover in order to judge the work justly. Elijah, a prophet, holding down his face, which is covered with his hand. God is talking with him, apparently in rebuke. The clothes on his breast are rent, and the action of the figures might suggest the idea of the scene between the deity and Elijah at Horeb, but there is no suggestion of the past magnificent scenery, of the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, so that the conjecture is good for very little. The painting is of small interest, the faces are vulgar, and the draperies have too much vapid historical dignity to be delightful. Jonah, the whale, here occupies fully one half of the canvas, being correspondent in value with a landscape background. His mouth is as large as a cavern, and yet, unless the mass of red colour in the foreground be a piece of drapery, his tongue is too large for it. He seems to have lifted Jonah out upon it, and not yet drawn it back, so that it forms a kind of crimson cushion for him to kneel upon in his submission to the deity. The head to which this vast tongue belongs is sketched in somewhat loosely, and there is little remarkable about it except its size, nor much in the figures, though the submissiveness of Jonah is well given. The great thought of Michelangelo renders one little charitable to any less imaginative treatment of this subject. Joshua, this is a most interesting picture, and it is a shame that its subject is not made out, for it is not a common one. The figure has a sword in its hand and looks up to a sky full of fire, out of which the form of the deity is stooping, represented as white and colourless. On the other side of the picture there is seen among the clouds a pillar apparently falling, and there is a crowd at the feet of the principal figure carrying spears. Unless this be Joshua at the fall of Jericho, I cannot tell what it means. It is painted with great vigour, and worthy of a better place. Sacrifice of Isaac. In conception, it is one of the least worthy of the master in the whole room, the three figures being thrown into violent attitudes, as inexpressive as they are 362 strained and artificial. It appears to have been vigorously painted, but vulgarly. That is to say, the light is concentrated upon the white beard and upturned countenance of Abraham, as it would have been in one of the dramatic effects of the French school, the result being that the head is very bright and very conspicuous, and perhaps in some of the late operations upon the roof, recently washed and touched. In consequence, every one who comes into the room is first invited to observe the Bella Testa di Abramo. The only thing characteristic of Tintoret is the way in which the pieces of ragged wood are tossed hither and thither in the pile upon which Isaac is bound, although this scattering of the wood is inconsistent with the scriptural account of Abraham's deliberate procedure, for we are told of him that he set the wood in order. But Tintoret had probably not noticed this, and thought the tossing of the timber into the disordered heap more like the act of the father in his agony. Elijah at the brook Cherith. I cannot tell if I have rightly interpreted the meaning of this picture, which merely represents a noble figure couched upon the ground, and an angel appearing to him, but I think that between the dark tree on the left and the recumbent figure there is some appearance of a running stream. At all events there is of a mountainous and stony place. The longer I study this master, the more I feel the strange likeness between him and Turner, in our never knowing what subject it is that will stir him to exertion. We have lately had him treating Jacob's dream, Ezekiel's vision, Abraham's sacrifice, and Jonah's prayer, all of them subjects on which the greatest painters have delighted to expend their strength, with coldness, carelessness, and evident absence of delight. And here, on a sudden, in a subject so indistinct that one cannot be sure of its meaning, and embracing only two figures, a man and an angel, forth he starts in his full strength. I believe he must somewhere or another the day before have seen a kingfisher, for this picture seems entirely painted for the sake of the glorious downy wings of the angel, white clouded with blue, as the bird's head and wings are with green, the softest and most elaborate in plumage that I have seen in any of his works. but observe also the general sublimity obtained by the mountainous lines of the drapery of the recumbent figure, dependent for its dignity upon these forms alone, as the face is more than half hidden, and what is seen of it expressionless. The Paschal Feast. I name this picture by the title given in the guidebooks. It represents merely 5 persons watching the increase of a small fire lighted on a table or altar in the midst of them. It is only because they have all staves in their hands that one may conjecture this fire to be that kindled to consume the paschal offering. The effect is of course a fire light, and like all mere fire lights that I have ever seen, totally devoid of interest. Elisha feeding the people. I again guess at the subject. The picture only represents a figure casting down a number of loaves before a multitude, but as Elisha has not elsewhere occurred, I suppose that these must be the barley loaves brought from Baal-shalisha. In conception and manner of painting, this picture and the last, together with the others above mentioned, in comparison with the Elijah at Cherith, may be generally described as dregs of Tintoret. They are tired, dead, dragged out upon the canvas apparently in the heavy-hearted state, which a man falls into when he is both jaded with toil and sick of the work he is employed upon. They are not hastily painted, on the contrary, finished with considerably more care than several of the works upon the walls, but those, as for instance, the agony in the garden, are hurried sketches with the man's whole heart in them, while these pictures are exhausted fulfillments of an appointed task. Whether they were really amongst the last painted, or whether the painter had fallen ill at some intermediate time, I cannot say, but we shall find him again in his utmost strength in the room which we last enter. 4th group, inner room on the upper floor. Inner room on the upper floor. On the roof. 36 to 39, children's heads. St. Rocco in heaven. 41 to 44, children. 45 to 56, allegorical figures. On the walls. Figure in niche. Christ before Pilate. Ex homo. Christ bearing his cross. Crucifixion. 36 to 39, 4 children's heads, which it is much to be regretted should be thus lost in filling small vacuities of the ceiling. St. Rocco in heaven, the central picture of the roof in the inner room. From the well-known anecdote respecting the production of this picture, whether in all its details true or not, we may at least gather that having been painted in competition with Paul Veronese and other powerful painters of the day, it was probably Tintoret's endeavour to make it as popular and showy as possible. It is quite different from his common works, bright in all its tints and tones. The face is carefully 365 drawn and of an agreeable type, the outlines firm and the shadows few, the whole resembling Correggio more than any Venetian painter. It is, however, an example of the danger, even to the greatest artist, of leaving his own style, for it lacks all the great virtues of Tintoret without obtaining the lusciousness of Correggio. One thing, at all events, is remarkable in it, that, though painted while the competitors were making their sketches, it shows no sign of haste or inattention. 41 to 44, figures of children merely decorative. 45 to 56, allegorical figures on the roof. If these were not in the same room with the crucifixion, they would attract more public attention than any works in the scuola, as there are here no black shadows, nor extravagances of invention, but very beautiful figures richly and delicately coloured, a good deal resembling some of the best works of Andrea del Sarto. There is nothing in them, however, requiring detailed examination. The 2 figures between the windows are very slovenly if they are his at all, and there are bits of marbling and fruit filling the cornices, which may or may not be his. If they are tired work and of small importance. Christ before Pilate, a most interesting picture, but which is unusual, best seen on a dark day, when the white figure of Christ alone draws the eye, looking almost like a spirit, the painting of the rest of the picture being both somewhat thin and imperfect. There is a certain meagreness about all the minor figures, less grandeur and largeness in the limbs and draperies, and less solidity, it seems, even in the colour, although its arrangements are richer than in many of the compositions above described. I hardly know whether it is owing to this thinness of colour, or on purpose, that the horizontal clouds shine through the crimson flag in the distance, though I should think the latter, for the effect is most beautiful. The passionate action of the scribe in lifting his hand to dip the pen into the inkhorn is, however, affected and overstrained, and the pillate is very mean, perhaps intentionally, that no reverence might be withdrawn from the person of Christ. In work of the 13th and 14th centuries, the figures of Pilate and Herod are always intentionally made contemptible. Ex homo, as usual, Tintoret's own peculiar view of the 366 subject. Christ is laid fainting on the ground, with a soldier standing on one side of him, while Pilate, on the other, withdraws the robe from the scourged and wounded body, and points it out to the Jews. Both this and the picture last mentioned resemble Titian more than Tintoret in the style of their treatment. Christ bearing his cross, Tintoret is here recognizable again in undiminished strength. He has represented the troops and attendants climbing Calvary by a winding path, of which 2 turns are seen, the figures on the uppermost ledge, and Christ in the center of them, being relieved against the sky. But instead of the usual simple expedient of the bright horizon to relieve the dark masses, there is here introduced, on the left, the head of a white horse, which blends itself with the sky in one broad mass of light. The power of the picture is chiefly in effect, the figure of Christ being too far off to be very interesting, and only the malefactors being seen on the nearer path. But for this very reason it seems to me more impressive, as if one had been truly present at the scene, though not exactly in the right place for seeing it. The crucifixion. I must leave this picture to work its will on the spectator, for it is beyond all analysis and above all praise. Est. Sagredo Palazzo on the Grand Canal, Roman too much defaced, but full of interest. Its sea story is restored. Its first floor has a most interesting arcade of the early 13th century third-order windows. Its upper windows are the finest 4th and 5th orders of early 14th century, the group of 4th orders in the centre being brought into some resemblance to the late Gothic traceries by the subsequent introduction of the catterfoils above them. Salute Church of Star. Mariadella on the Grand Canal, Roman II, one of the earliest buildings of the grotesque Renaissance, rendered impressive by its position, size, and general proportions. These latter are exceedingly good, the grace of the whole building being chiefly dependent on the inequality of size in its cupolas, and pretty grouping of the 2 campaniles behind them. It is to be generally observed that 367, the proportions of buildings, have nothing whatever to do with the style or general merits of their architecture. An architect trained in the worst schools, and utterly devoid of all meaning or purpose in his work, may yet have such a natural gift of massing and grouping as will render all his structures effective when seen from a distance. Such a gift is very general with the late Italian builders, so that many of the most contemptible edifices in the country have good stage effect so long as we do not approach them. The Church of the Salute is farther assisted by the beautiful flight of steps in front of it down to the canal, and its facade is rich and beautiful of its kind, and was chosen by Turner for the principal object in his well-known view of the Grand Canal. The principal faults of the building are the meagre windows in the sides of the cupola, and the ridiculous disguise of the buttresses under the form of colossal scrolls, the buttresses themselves being originally a hypocrisy, for the cupola is stated by Lazari to be of timber, and therefore needs none. The sacristy contains several precious pictures. The 3 on its roof by Titian, much vaunted, are indeed as feeble as they are monstrous, but the small Titian, St. Mark with SDS, Cosmo and Damien, was when I first saw it to my judgment by far the first work of Titian's in Venice. It has since been restored by the Academy, and it seemed to me entirely destroyed, but I had not time to examine it carefully. At the end of the larger sacristy is the lunette which once decorated the tomb of the Doge Francesco Dandolo, see above, page 74, and at the side of it, one of the most highly finished Tintorets in Venice, namely, The Marriage in Cana, an immense picture, some 25 feet long by 15 high, and said by Lazari to be one of the few which Tintoret signed with his name. I am not surprised at his having done so in this case. Evidently the work has been a favourite with him, and he has taken as much pains as it was ever necessary for his colossal strength to take with anything. The subject is not one which admits of much singularity or energy in composition. It was always a favourite one with Veronese, because it gave dramatic interest to figures in gay costumes and of cheerful countenances. But one is surprised 368 to find Tintoret, whose tone of mind was always grave, and who did not like to make a picture out of brocades and diadems, throwing his whole strength into the conception of a marriage feast. But so it is, and there are assuredly no female heads in any of his pictures in Venice, elaborated so far as those which here form the central light. Neither is it often that the works of this mighty master conform themselves to any of the rules acted upon by ordinary painters, but in this instance the popular laws have been observed, and an academy student would be delighted to see with what severity the principal light is arranged. In a central mass, which is divided and made more brilliant by a vigorous piece of shadow thrust into the midst of it, and which dies away in lesser fragments and sparkling towards the extremities of the picture, this mass of light is as interesting by its composition as by its intensity. The cicerone who escorts the stranger round the sacristy in the course of 5 minutes, and allows him some 40 seconds for the contemplation of a picture which the study of 6 months would not entirely fathom, directs his attention very carefully to the bel effetto di prospettivo, the whole merit of the picture being in the eyes of the intelligent public that there is a long table in it, one end of which looks farther off than the other. But there is more in the bel effetto di prospettivo than the observance of the common laws of optics. The table is set in a spacious chamber, of which the windows at the end let in the light from the horizon, and those in the side wall the intense blue of an eastern sky. The spectator looks all along the table, at the farther end of which are seated Christ and the Madonna, the marriage guests on each side of it, on one side men, on the other women. The men are set with their backs to the light, which passing over their heads and glancing slightly on the tablecloth, falls in full length along the line of young Venetian women, who thus fill the whole centre of the picture with one broad sunbeam, made up of fair faces and golden hair. Close to the spectator, a woman has risen in amazement, and stretches across the table to show the wine in her cup to those opposite. Her dark red dress intercepts and enhances the mass of gathered light. It is rather curious, considering the subject of the picture, that one cannot 369 distinguish either the bride or the bridegroom, but the fourth figure from the Madonna in the line of women, who wears a white headdress of lace and rich chains of pearls in her hair, may well be accepted for the former, and I think that between her and the woman on the Madonna's left hand the unity of the line of women is intercepted by a male figure. Be this as it may, this fourth female face is the most beautiful, as far as I recollect, that occurs in the works of the painter, with the exception only of the Madonna in the flight into Egypt. It is an ideal which occurs indeed elsewhere in many of his works, a face at once dark and delicate, the Italian cast of feature moulded with the softness and childishness of English beauty some half a century ago, but I have never seen the ideal so completely worked out by the master. The face may best be described as one of the purest and softest of Stothard's conceptions, executed with all the strength of Tintoret. The other women are all made inferior to this one, but there are beautiful profiles and bendings of breasts and necks along the whole line. The men are all subordinate, though there are interesting portraits among them, perhaps the only fault of the picture being that the faces are a little too conspicuous, seen like balls of light among the crowd of minor figures which fill the background of the picture. The tone of the whole is sober and majestic in the highest degree, the dresses are all broad masses of colour, and the only parts of the picture which lay claim to the expression of wealth or splendour are the head-dresses of the women. In this respect, the conception of the scene differs widely from that of Veronese, and approaches more nearly to the probable truth. Still, the marriage is not an unimportant one, an immense crowd filling the background, forming superbly rich mosaic of colour against the distant sky. Taken as a whole, the picture is perhaps the most perfect example which human art has produced of the utmost possible force and sharpness of shadow united with richness of local colour. In all the other works of Tintoret, and much more of other colourists, either the light and shade or the local colour is predominant. In the one case the picture has a tendency to look as if painted by candlelight, in the other it becomes daringly conventional, and approaches the conditions of 370 glass painting. This picture unites colour as rich as Titian's with light, and shade as forcible as Rembrandt's, and far more decisive. There are one or two other interesting pictures of the early Venetian schools in this sacristy, and several important tombs in the adjoining cloister, among which that of Francesco Dandolo, transported here from the Church of the Frari, deserves a special attention. See above. Salvator, Church of St. Base Renaissance, occupying the place of the ancient church, under the porch of which the Pope Alexander III is said to have passed the night. 1000. Lazari states it to have been richly decorated with mosaics. Now all is gone. In the interior of the church are some of the best examples of Renaissance sculptural monuments in Venice. See above, chap. 280. It is said to possess an important parlor of silver of the 13th century, one of the objects in Venice which I much regret having forgotten to examine, besides 2 Titians, a Bonifacio and a John Bellini. The latter, the Supper at Emmaus, must, I think, have been entirely repainted. It is not only unworthy of the master but unlike him, as far at least as I could see from below, for it is hung high. Sanudo Palazzo, at the Miracali, a noble Gothic palace of the 14th century with Byzantine fragments and cornices built into its walls, especially round the interior court, in which the staircase is very noble. Its door, opening on the quay, is the only one in Venice entirely uninjured, retaining its wooden valve richly sculptured, its wicket for examination of the stranger demanding admittance, and its quaint knocker in the form of a fish. Scalzi, Church of the. It possesses a fine John Bellini and is renowned through Venice for its precious marbles. I omitted to notice above, in speaking of the buildings of the grotesque Renaissance, that many of them are remarkable for a kind of dishonesty, even in the use of true marbles, resulting not from motives of economy, but from mere love of juggling and falsehood for their own sake. I hardly know which condition of mind is meanest, that which has pride in plaster made to look 371 like marble, or that which takes delight in marble made to look like silk. Several of the later churches in Venice, more especially those of the Jesuiti, of San Clement, and this of the Scalzi, rest their chief claims to admiration on their having curtains and cushions cut out of rock. The most ridiculous example is in San Clement, and the most curious and costly are in the Scalzi, which latter church is a perfect type of the vulgar abuse of marble in every possible way, by men who had no eye for colour, and no understanding of any merit in a work of art, but that which arises from costliness of material, and such powers of imitation as are devoted in England to the manufacture of peaches and eggs out of Derbyshire spar. Sebastian, Church of St. the Tomb, and of old the monument of Paul Veronese. It is full of his noblest pictures, or of what once were such, but they seem to me for the most part destroyed by repainting. I had not time to examine them justly, but I would especially direct the traveller's attention to the small Madonna over the second altar on the right of the nave, still a perfect and priceless treasure. Cervi, Church of the. Only 2 of its gates and some ruined walls are left, in one of the foulest districts of the city. It was one of the most interesting monuments of the early 14th century Gothic, and there is much beauty in the fragments yet remaining. How long they may stand I know not, the whole building having been offered me for sale, ground and all, or stone by stone as I chose by its present proprietor, when I was last in Venice. More real good might at present be effected by any wealthy person who would devote his resources to the preservation of such monuments wherever they exist, by freehold purchase of the entire ruin, and afterwards by taking proper charge of it, and forming a garden round it, than by any other mode of protecting or encouraging art. There is no school, no lecturer, like a ruin of the early ages. Severo Fondamenta San, Palace at Roman II. Silvestro, Church of St. of no importance in itself, but it contains 2 very interesting pictures. The first, a St. Thomas of Canterbury with the Baptist and St. Francis, by 372 Girolamo Santa Croce, a superb example of the Venetian religious school. The second by Tintoret, namely, the Baptism of Christ, over the first altar on the right of the nave, an upright picture some 10 feet wide by 15 high. The top of it is arched, representing the Father supported by angels. It requires little knowledge of Tintoret to see that these figures are not by his hand. By returning to the opposite side of the nave, the join in the canvas may be plainly seen, the upper part of the picture having been entirely added on. Whether it had this upper part before it was repainted, or whether originally square, cannot now be told, but I believe it had an upper part which has been destroyed. I am not sure if even the dove and the 2 angels which are at the top of the older part of the picture are quite genuine. The rest of it is magnificent, though both the figures of the Saviour and the Baptist show some concession on the part of the painter to the imperative requirement of his age, that nothing should be done except in an attitude. Neither are there any of his usual fantastic imaginations. There is simply the Christ in the water and the Saint John on the shore without attendants, disciples, or witnesses of any kind, but the power of the light and shade, and the splendor of the landscape, which on the whole is well preserved, render it a most interesting example. The Jordan is represented as a mountain brook, receiving a tributary stream in a cascade from the rocks in which St. John stands. There is a rounded stone in the center of the current, and the parting of the water at this, as well as its rippling among the roots of some dark trees on the left, are among the most accurate remembrances of nature to be found in any of the works of the great masters. I hardly know whether most to wonder at the power of the man who thus broke through the neglect of nature which was universal at his time, or at the evidences, visible throughout the whole of the conception, that he was still content to paint from slight memories of what he had seen in hill countries, instead of following out to its full depth the fountain which he had opened. There is not a stream among the hills of Priuli which in any quarter of a mile of its course would not have suggested to him finer forms of cascade than those which he has idly painted at Venice. Simon Profta, Church of St., very important though small, possessing the precious statue of St. Simeon above noticed, Roman II. The rare early Gothic capitals of the nave are only interesting to the architect. But in the little passage by the side of the church, leading out of the Campo, there is a curious Gothic monument built into the wall, very beautiful in the placing of the angels in the spandrels, and rich in the vine-leaf moulding above. Simone Piccolo, Church of St., one of the ugliest churches in Venice or elsewhere. Its black dome, like an unusual species of gasometer, is the admiration of modern Italian architects. Salisbury Ponte, the well-known Bridge of Sighs, a work of no merit and of a late period see Val. 2, owing the interest it possesses chiefly to its pretty name and to the ignorant sentimentalism of Byron. Spirito Santo, Church of no importance. Stefano, Church of St., an interesting building of central Gothic, the best ecclesiastical example of it in Venice. The west entrance is much later than any of the rest, and is of the richest Renaissance Gothic, a little anterior to the Porta della Carta, and first-rate of its kind. The manner of the introduction of the figure of the angel at the top of the arch is full of beauty. Note the extravagant crockets and cusp finials as signs of decline. Stefano, Church of St., at Murano pugnacity of its abbot, Roman II. The church no longer exists. Strope Campiello della House in Roman II. Tana windows at the Roman II. Tipolo Palazzo on the Grand Canal, of no importance. Tolentini Church of one of the basest and coldest works of the late Renaissance, it is said to contain 2 Bonifacios. Toma Church of St. of no importance. Toma Pont San. There is an interesting ancient doorway opening on the canal close to this bridge, probably of the 12th century, and a good early Gothic door, opening upon the bridge itself. Torcello general aspect of 2, Santa Fosca at 1-2, Duomo 2, mosaics of 2, measures of 2, date of Roman 2. Trevisan Palazzo 1 Roman 3. Tran Palazzo, of no importance. Travaso, Church of St. itself of no importance, but containing 2 pictures by Tintoret, namely The Temptation of St. Anthony, altar piece in the chapel on the left of the choir. A small and very carefully finished picture, but marvellously temperate and quiet in treatment, especially considering the subject, which one would have imagined likely to inspire the painter with one of his most fantastic visions. As if on purpose to disappoint us, both the effect and the conception of the figures are perfectly quiet, and appear the result much more of careful study than of vigorous imagination. The effect is one of plain daylight. There are a few clouds drifting in the distance, but with no wildness in them, nor is there any energy or heat in the flames which mantle about the waist of one of the figures. But for the noble workmanship, we might almost fancy it the production of a modern academy, yet as we begin to read the picture, the painter's mind becomes felt. St. Anthony is surrounded by 4 figures, one of which only has the form of a demon, and he is in the background, engaged in no more terrific act of violence towards St. Anthony than endeavouring to pull off his mantle. He has, however, a scourge over his shoulder, but this is probably intended for St. Anthony's weapon of self-discipline, which the fiend, with a very Protestant turn of mind, is carrying off. A broken staff with a bell hanging to it at the saint's feet also expresses his interrupted devotion. The 3 other figures beside him are bent on more cunning mischief, The woman on the left is one of Tintoret's best portraits of a young and bright-eyed Venetian beauty. It is curious that he has given so attractive a countenance to a type apparently of the temptation to violate the power of poverty, for this woman places one hand in a vase full of coins and shakes golden chains with the other. On the opposite side of the saint, another woman, admirably painted, but of a far less attractive countenance, is a type of the lusts of the flesh, yet 375 there is nothing gross or immodest in her dress or gesture. She appears to have been baffled, and for the present to have given up addressing the saint. She lays one hand upon her breast, and might be taken for a very respectable person, but that there are flames playing about her loins. A recumbent figure on the ground is of less intelligible character, but may perhaps be meant for indolence. At all events he has torn the saint's book to pieces. I forgot to note that under the figure representing avarice there is a creature like a pig. Whether actual pig or not is unascertainable, for the church is dark, the little light that comes on the picture falls on it the wrong way, and 1/3 of the lower part of it is hidden by a white case, containing a modern daub, lately painted by way of an altar piece. The meaning, as well as the merit, of the grand old picture being now far beyond the comprehension both of priests and people. The Last Supper, on the left-hand side of the chapel of the sacrament, a picture which has been through the hands of the Academy and is therefore now hardly worth notice. Its conception seems always to have been vulgar and far below Tintoret's usual standard. There is singular baseness in the circumstance that one of the near apostles, while all the others are, as usual, intent upon Christ's words, "One of you shall betray me," is going to help himself to wine out of a bottle which stands behind him. In so doing he stoops towards the table, the flask being on the floor. If intended for the action of Judas at this moment, there is the painter's usual originality in the thought, but it seems to me rather done to obtain variation of posture, in bringing the red dress into strong contrast with the tablecloth. The colour has once been fine, and there are fragments of good painting still left, but the light does not permit these to be seen, and there is too much perfect work of the masters in Venice to permit us to spend time on retouched remnants. The picture is only worth mentioning because it is ignorantly and ridiculously referred to by Kugler as characteristic of Tintoret. V. Vitali Church of St., said to contain a picture by Vitor Carpaccio over the high altar, otherwise of no importance. Volto Santo Church of the, an interesting but desecrated ruin of the 14th century, fine in style. Its roof retains some fresco colouring, but as far as I recollect of later date than the architecture. Z. Zaccaria Church of St. Early Renaissance and fine of its kind. A Gothic chapel attached to it is of great beauty. It contains the best John Bellini in Venice, after that of San G. Grisostomo, the Virgin with 4 saints, and is said to contain another John Bellini and a Tintoret, neither of which I have seen. Zeitel Church of no importance. Zobnigo Church of Santa Maria, Roman 3, it contains one valuable Tintoret, namely Christ with Star, Justina and St. Augustine, over the third altar on the south side of the nave, a picture of small size and upright about 10 feet by 8. Christ appears to be descending out of the clouds between the two saints, who are both kneeling on the seashore. It is a Venetian sea, breaking on a flat beach like the Lido, with a scarlet galley in the middle distance, of which the chief use is to unite the two figures by a point of colour. Both the saints are respectable Venetians of the lower class, in homely dresses and with homely faces. The whole picture is quietly painted, and somewhat slightly, free from all extravagance, and displaying little power except in the general truth or harmony of colours so easily laid on. It is better preserved than usual, and worth dwelling upon as an instance of the style of the master when at rest.